No one could have anticipated the shocking discovery in an old, closed-down, no-frills supermarket in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Contractors went to work on the vacant building thinking they were just going in for the daily grind on an ordinary cold day in January of 2019. They probably started their day like anyone else, drinking a hot cup of coffee before venturing into hard manual labor. But this would be no run-of-the-mill type of workday for them. As they started removing the store's empty shelving units and coolers, they found something deeply disturbing. A human body. It's a sight that most people would rather not have to face or come across, especially not when they least expect it. Authorities could not immediately identify the body or even determine the person's sex or age. It had to be sent to the Iowa State Medical Examiner's office for a thorough autopsy. Only then could the individual be identified as Larry Eli Murillo Moncada, a man who had been reported missing 10 years ago back in 2009. Murillo Moncada was only 25 years old when he disappeared. He worked as an employee of the no-frills supermarket while it was still operational. The mystery over his initial disappearance turned into a new mystery as the recovery of his remains sparked more questions than answers. People were baffled, wondering how a young guy could just die at work one day and go unnoticed for years on end, almost an entire decade undetected. The man was reported missing on November 28, 2009, during the midst of a heavy snowstorm. His parents last saw him leaving with no shoes, no socks, no keys, and no car. Before his disappearance, he was reportedly experiencing some severe mental health issues. His mother explained that he arrived home from work that Thanksgiving seeming very disoriented. He began hearing voices telling him to eat sugar. He complained that his heart was beating too hard and that he needed sugar to calm it. He also felt that he was being followed and he was very scared. It was possible that he was experiencing some form of psychosis provoked by intense anxiety, causing schizophrenia-like symptoms of paranoia, hallucinations, and delusions. He'd just been prescribed antidepressants by a doctor upon his disappearance. He ran off and was never heard from again. There was no activity on his debit or credit card, and the no-frills supermarket reported that he stopped showing up for work. For a long time, his whereabouts remained unknown. His poor mother must have been frantic. Here's what is believed to have happened. Former employees at the no-frills supermarket explained that they would sometimes climb into the space above the coolers, which was used for storage. Murillo Moncada went into work on that fateful day and probably tried to climb into the storage space. Perhaps he was still feeling distressed and needed some time alone to gather himself. Maybe he viewed the storage space as a good place to do this, or perhaps he just needed to grab something. Whatever the case may be, we can speculate that when he pulled himself on top of the coolers, he must have fallen behind them. He then became trapped in the 12-foot, 18-inch wide space between the coolers and the wall. Now, here's the disturbing part of the story. Because the noise being generated by the coolers was so loud, there was probably no way that anyone could have heard him if he screamed for help. That means that if he did not die instantly from the fall, he could have met a very lonely, slow, and terrifying demise, almost like one would feel being buried alive. Only in this case, there were people around who could have helped him, but sadly he was powerless to get their attention. To make matters worse, he wasn't scheduled to work that day, so no one even knew he was there or thought to look for him. By the time he was found, Murillo Moncada's body was completely unrecognizable. He was only able to be identified by using the DNA from his parents. This probably provided them with the worst kind of closure, as they probably hoped their son was still alive somewhere. Investigators examined the results of the autopsy and determined his death to be accidental. Still, one can't help but wonder how the no-frills supermarket managed to go so long without discovering the body. It's creepy to think that the employees probably continued to utilize the storage space while not realizing that there was a dead coworker lying beneath them. How, throughout the span of many years, did they never once think to check or clean the space back there? How could a body just remain unfound in a public space for so long? The eerie component to this story may be the thought that this can indeed happen, and if it occurred for Murillo Moncada, it can happen to you too. So then you might wonder if this has happened anywhere else. People are reported missing all the time, so how many bodies remain unfound in the most obvious of places? At your local grocery store, your favorite novelty shop, a restaurant you frequently visit. For the Iowa no-frills supermarket, this was certainly the case. Shoppers innocently frequented the store for years, blissfully unaware that death hid behind the coolers in the back room. You see this type of story on crime shows and mystery thrillers, but you never anticipate that something like this could be brought so close to home. For this reason, Murillo Moncada's father, Victor Murillo, demanded answers. It's understandable that he would be just as baffled over the situation as anyone else, and even more so since he was directly related to the victim. The grieving father, suffering tremendous pain over the loss, asked the question, how can a body just be there undetected? Investigators described the situation as being very unique, to say the least. The store continued to run for 7 long years after Murillo Moncada's fatal disappearance. It only just closed its doors in 2016, 3 years before his body was uncovered. Perhaps after hearing this story, you may never walk into a supermarket the same way again. It's hard to think about and spooky enough to make your skin crawl, yet it teaches a ghastly lesson that tragedy can lurk in the shadows of everyday mundane life. And there is another lesson to be learned from the events that led to Moncada's disappearance and death. That is, the problems associated with his mental health that pushed him to run away from home in the first place and act in irrational ways. Heading out amid a snowstorm without being properly equipped with shoes or socks. We here at the Infographic Show believe in the vitality of mental health, and if you or someone you know struggles from anxiety or cognitive disturbance, you should seek help right away. Your mental health is as important as your physical health and should be taken just as seriously. There's nothing shameful about receiving help, and we strongly encourage it. The circumstances surrounding the death of Murillo Moncada are unfortunate and mysterious. One can't help but wonder what he must have experienced or felt during his final hours. Though grim, one can only hope that when he fell he landed on his head and died instantaneously, because at least that would have been a far better fate than what could have transpired against him. Namely, being consumed by the fear and awareness of being trapped. Since the autopsy of his body could not find an exact cause of death, there is no way to know for certain what went on behind those coolers during the time. All we know for sure is that it went on under the noses of those working and shopping at that no-frills supermarket, and this is a grisly reality that won't soon be forgotten.
In order for police to be able to file a missing persons report, that person will usually have to have been missing for about 24 hours. This might differ from country to country, but if police think there is sufficient information to make a report, they will. The USA's National Crime Information Center tells us that in 2017, there were just under 500,000 missing people reported, both male and female, and under the age of 21. Over 21, the number of reports added up to around 158,000. That's a lot of people reported missing, but many are found quite quickly, some having been on a 2-day drinking binge, others hiding in the garden shed. Unfortunately, others go missing for a long time. Today, we'll look at some of the strangest cases in this episode of the Infographic Show, Missing People Mysteriously Found Alive. Number 8, The Missing Doctor. We'll start with perhaps a happier case of a missing person and finish with more gruesome cases. This is the story of Carlos Sanchez Ortiz de Salazar, a Spanish doctor that went missing in 1995. For years, people searched for him, and then in 2010, he was presumed dead. But the doctor was resurrected. He was found alive in 2015, living as a hermit in a forest close to the Maremma coast in Tuscany. According to reports, he was found by mushroom pickers who he told, "I am Spanish, my name is Carlos, and I have been here for 20 years. His family was over the moon, but when they arrived at the forest, the man of the wild had already gone. Unfortunately, the media didn't write any updates on the matter. Number 7, the man who lost himself. This is the case of an Australian man named Gabriel Nagy. According to Australian news reports, the father of 2 called his wife to say he'd be home for lunch. That was in 1987. He didn't have lunch that day or the day after. In fact, he wasn't seen for a very long time. His burned out car was found, but he wasn't. His daughter later told the press, "It really affected me emotionally. People would ask, 'Where's your dad?' It was too much, too painful. Where did Gabriel go?" After years of searching, the family just thought he must be dead. More than 20 years later, he was about to be officially presumed dead, and one final check in Medicare records revealed the name Gabriel Nagy. It turned out that after his crash, he'd been living in a state of dissociative fugue, which is a rare mental condition wherein someone can lose their memories and their identity. It can last for years, and the people just create a new identity. After he was found, Nagy told the press, "I'd been living under a pseudonym for a long time, but I'd been having flashes of my proper name. Things were slowly returning." He wandered around Australia doing odd jobs, working on boats, sometimes sleeping rough and taking up drinking. He He was scooped up and taken to meet his family more than 2 decades later. The person who found me asked me lots of questions and started showing me photographs. It was like a cartoon where flashbulbs go off on top of people's heads, he told the press. He was reintroduced to his daughters with many tears flowing. One daughter, now in her 30s, said, "I want to give people hope that sometimes good things can happen. Miracles can happen." Number 6, missing half a century. This has to be one of the longest periods of time that someone has gone missing. American-Canadian Lucy Ann Johnson disappeared in 1961 and wasn't found until 2013. Where had she been all that time? She'd been living in British Columbia with her new husband and 2 kids when she went missing. The police believed that the husband might have killed her, but that wasn't the case. He had been abusing her, and that's why she took off. The husband died in the 90s, and police never gave up on this mysterious disappearing woman. Then in 2013, she was featured in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police's Missing Person of the Month initiative. Lucy's daughter, now with grown-up kids of her own, also found out her mother could be in Yukon and started a search there. The daughter was then contacted by a woman who said she was also Lucy's daughter, but living in Yukon. Age 77, Lucy was found. She had 4 kids and told the police she had left all those years ago because her husband was a violent man. She was reunited with her old family, minus the husband, of course. Number 5, finding himself. This has got to be one of the strangest cases ever, as this guy, Edgar Ladalip, was missing for 30 years, but was also about a 90-minute drive from where he went missing. He disappeared in 1986 from a town in Ontario, Canada, and was found close to that town some 30 years later, now aged 50. It's said he was in a home when he went missing as he suffered from mental health problems. He never mentally grew up. The last time his mother had seen him, he was in a hospital recovering from an attempted suicide. And then he was gone. Police report that Ladalip went missing without his medication, and it was unlikely he could survive on his own. But he did, albeit with memory problems after hitting his head. Gradually, his old life came back to him, and one day he told a social worker that he could even remember the name he used to have, Edgar Ladalip. She contacted authorities, and the missing man was found. He found himself, really. Cops called his mother and told her the news. After 30 years of not knowing where her son is, knowing that he's alive, she's pretty excited about that, they told the press. Number 4, abducted. Abductions could be a show in themselves. We'll discuss only one. This was the abduction of an American girl called J.C. Duggard. She went missing in 1991, aged just 11 years old, from her house in South Lake Tahoe, California. Her stepfather even saw her being abducted and gave chase, but he couldn't catch the assailant. She was held captive by a man that would abuse her and have children with her. That went on for 18 years in total. The abductors were Philip and Nancy Garrido. Philip had a history of rape and kidnapping, but he wasn't caught until he turned up at the University of California in 2009. That led to suspicion after background checks were done and the man was arrested. Police then searched his home and found Duggard, now a woman. She explained she'd been kept in handcuffs for almost 2 years, but then allowed some freedom in the basement of the couple's house. After years, she had 2 kids with the man and developed what we call Stockholm Syndrome, meaning she trusted her own captor. She even left the house at times and started working as a graphic designer in her captor's company. To the neighbors, the woman and her kids just looked like normal folks. Duggard has since written 2 books, and numerous TV documentaries have been made about her experience. In one of her books she wrote, "I don't believe in hate. To me, it wastes too much time. People who hate waste so much of their life hating that they miss out on all of the other stuff out there." Number 3, jungle paranoia. Okay, so you might have heard this story before, but how could we not include this amazing tale? Hiru Onoda was a Japanese soldier who was sent to the Philippines during World War II. The thing is, while he was there, the war ended and Japan lost. The man went into the hills and started a guerrilla campaign against the locals, still believing a war was going on. According to reports, the Japanese knew soldiers were there and even dropped leaflets into the jungle, but Onoda thought they were a trap. He soldiered on he went for years, with reports saying the men he was with were all but dead come 1972. Onoda's own family had no hopes he would ever return. He was like Colonel Kurtz in the Joseph Conrad book Heart of Darkness. The story gets even crazier when we hear that a man called Norio Suzuki went in search of Onoda. Suzuki was an explorer, and he believed he could find the missing man, and he found what he was looking for. Onoda later told the press, "This hippie boy Suzuki came to the island to listen to the feelings of a Japanese soldier. Suzuki asked me why I would not come out. The army was then sent to the jungle and relieved Onoda of his duty." The soldier gave up his sword, his rifle, his ammunition, and said he would go home. He returned to Japan a hero and wrote a book called No Surrender, My 30-Year War. He wasn't as popular with the Filipino people as he had killed quite a few of them while he was in hiding. Number 2. Missing Mom. In 1970, an American woman called Lula Cora Hood left her family after an argument. Then, in 1996, Illinois cops contacted the 3 kids that had been left behind and informed them that they thought they had found the remains of their mother. And that was that. Goodbye, Mom. But it wasn't the case after more DNA tests were done, and Hood was found some 40 years after she'd gone missing. She was living in Florida, aged 84, and was doing just fine. I was too young to know what it was about, but she was told to leave, and that's exactly what she did. One of her daughters told the press she never came back. It turned out her mother had 14 kids over her lifetime. Number 1. Scandal on Dewsbury Moor. This has to be one of the craziest stories about missing people, one that kept the tabloid media in the UK busy for a time, and ended up causing mayhem on a council estate in a rundown industrial town in northern England. The story takes place in 2009. Only a couple of years after a young girl named Madeleine Beth McCann went missing while on holiday with her parents in Portugal. McCann had never been found, and so when a girl went missing again, it had the tabloid reading public in a frenzy. Except this case was a whole lot different. The mob was certainly moved, and an entire community went out looking for this 9-year-old girl. At one point, writes the Yorkshire Post, a 43-year-old man who lived down the road from the missing girl was overpowered by a mob and nailed to wood, essentially crucified. It could have been drug-related, but the timing made police think differently. Anyway, after tearful appeals on TV by Shannon's mother, it turned out she disappeared her own daughter. Shannon was found almost 1 month later, hidden in a bed inside a house owned by the uncle of the mother's boyfriend. It turned out they'd seen how the public had gotten behind the parents of little Madeleine a couple of years before, and thought they could pull off a stunt and get away with some decent reward money once they figured out how to find Shannon. Subsequent investigators revealed that the mother was horrid, and she had often given Shannon strong sleeping pills to keep her quiet. The mother's boyfriend was charged with having movies involving children doing things they should not be doing. Poor Shannon was given a new name and put into foster care. The mother had to change her name once she was out of jail, lest she ended up with a fate worse than crucifixion. You can see what happened in detail in a number of documentaries that were made about the case.
Just after 1 a.m. on March 8, 2014, Malaysian Airlines flight number 370 en route to Beijing, China from Kuala Lumpur checked in with Malaysia Air Traffic Control. "Good night, Malaysia 370" were the last words anyone heard from Flight 370 before the Boeing 777 disappeared from the face of the earth, with 239 souls on board. Now, 6 years later, there are still more questions than answers about the Malaysian air mystery, and what we now know about the missing flight MH370 is truly shocking. Almost immediately after the last check-in, just as the plane was crossing from Malaysian airspace into Vietnamese airspace, flight MH370 disappeared from radar screens. In the confusion of the zone crossing, it took more than 18 minutes for air traffic controllers to even notice the plane was missing. Officials on the ground attempted to reach the aircraft numerous times over the next several hours, but the calls went unanswered. The official distress call alerting Kuala Lumpur's Aeronautical Rescue Coordination Center that an aircraft and its passengers might be in mortal danger wasn't made until after 6 a.m., more than 4 hours after the plane disappeared. Early search efforts focused on the South China Sea, but 34 ships and 28 aircraft from 7 different countries could find no trace of the plane. It quickly became apparent they were looking in the entirely wrong area. Within a matter of days after the plane's disappearance, analysis of radar and satellite data provided the shocking details of flight MH370's final hours. Almost immediately after the goodnight message, the plane veered dramatically off course. It first made an abrupt turn to the southwest and flew back over the Malay Peninsula, then banked around the island of Penang before heading northwest up the Strait of Malacca and out across the Andaman Sea. This maneuver took more than an hour to accomplish, but the most shocking revelation from the radar data was the fact that after the deviation, the plane cruised on autopilot for hours before it ran out of fuel and plunged into the Indian Ocean, thousands of miles away from the initial search area. There were 3 major investigations in the immediate aftermath of the crash. Australia led the main investigations and search efforts as they were the closest to the assumed crash site, 1,200 miles southwest of Perth, and were well equipped to handle a major marine search. They began searching by air but found no trace of the plane. The time wasted searching the South China Sea likely cost them any chance of recovering the wreckage and the plane's black boxes. After 2 months of fruitless air searches, the team turned their attention to mapping and scouring the ocean floor in one of the deepest, most unexplored regions of the Indian Ocean. Unsurprisingly, their efforts failed to find any sign of the plane, and the investigation was closed after 3 years. The Malaysian police conducted their own internal investigation, which mainly consisted of background checks on the passengers and crew. The results were underwhelming, to say the least. The report was released in 2017, and it concluded that they were unable to determine a cause for the disappearance of flight MH370. It also cleared all passengers and crew of any suspicion. The third official investigation was an international accident inquiry, and it was a mess from the start. International cooperation in the immediate aftermath of a tragedy is difficult under the best of circumstances, but dealing with the autocratic and corrupt Malaysian regime made it nearly impossible to conduct a thorough investigation. It was clear that the Malaysians just wanted the whole situation to go away. It's unlikely they were covering up anything sinister. They simply didn't know what they would find if they looked too closely, and they couldn't risk uncovering anything that would reflect poorly on the government or its airline. It quickly became obvious that the Malaysians knew a lot more about the disappearance than what they shared with the world. A Malaysian military base picked up the plane on their radar after it deviated from its flight path, but they neglected to investigate the unexpected aircraft because it looked friendly. The Malaysians knew about the change in flight path early on and withheld that information even as rescuers wasted precious hours and days searching in the wrong area. In time, more details that Malaysian officials tried to keep secret would find their way to the public and help paint a picture of what had happened to flight MH370 and why. But at the time, due to a lack of cooperation and reliable data, the third investigation was also unable to determine a cause for the disappearance and was closed. While official investigations proved inconclusive, the search continues to this day, and recent finds have led to many new revelations about the fate of flight MH370. A group of volunteer engineers and scientists who met online and called themselves the Independent Group studied the available data and helped narrow down the search area. Using radar and satellite data, investigators and volunteers were able to recreate the plane's trajectory and pinpoint its last known location. As the plane cruised south over the vast expanse of ocean towards Antarctica, which was far outside of its range, it crossed paths with the satellite, and their electronic handshake provides us with a general idea of the plane's last known location somewhere southwest of Australia. Other investigators used a different tactic, working backward from locations where debris eventually drifted ashore and analyzing weather systems, drift patterns, and currents to recreate the debris' journey and find the plane's final resting place. This is a much bigger task than you might imagine, considering the millions of square miles of water and tens of thousands of miles of coastline in the Indian Ocean. Experts also had to worry about a phenomenon that they dubbed the Gibson effect. Searchers focusing their attention on areas where debris had already been found simply because people were already looking there can take focus off of other areas, particularly to the north, where debris might yet be found, and skew the data. The Gibson effect was named for Blaine Gibson, an American lawyer/adventurer whose goal is to visit every country in the world. Gibson also can't resist a mystery, and since learning the fate of flight MH370, he's arranged his travels to allow him to help the search efforts. After visiting Malaysia and meeting some of the families of those lost on flight MH370, Gibson figured the best way he could help was by being on the ground, and he began visiting coastal areas where debris might wash up and painstakingly combing the beaches for clues. Even though this amounted to searching for a needle in a haystack, Gibson's crazy idea actually paid off. On the advice of some Australian oceanographers about ocean currents and drift patterns, Gibson first visited Mozambique, where he asked local fishermen to show him where they'd often find washed-up nets and fishing equipment. Against all odds, there he found a scrap of metal that looked suspiciously like a plane part, and it was later confirmed to be part of MH370's horizontal stabilizer panel. More discoveries would follow, and Gibson built a network of locals all along the Indian Ocean coastline who would bring or sell him their finds. In the end, of the several dozen pieces of debris found that were confirmed or suspected to be from MH370, Gibson would be personally responsible for finding 1/3 of those pieces. And in case he ever forgot why he was doing this, he often found empty purses and backpacks washed up along with the debris, a haunting reminder of the lives lost. So what are the biggest things we've learned in the years since Malaysian flight MH370 disappeared? What do we know now that we didn't know back then? Well, first of all, we can rule out most of the prevailing conspiracy theories about Flight MH370 that are kicking around online. There's a faction that claims the unusual signals picked up by radar and satellites were fraudulent, designed to disguise the plane's true flight, although proponents of this theory don't seem to have any idea what the point of that true flight was. There's also the British tarot card reader who was sailing near South Asia when she witnessed what looked like a missile or a plane on a suicide mission flying low overhead, headed for a nearby Chinese fleet. When she returned from her holiday and learned of the disappearance of Flight MH370, she concluded that what she had seen must have been the missing plane and spread her theory across the web, despite being nowhere near the plane's path. There are even those who believe that the plane flew into some sort of time warp or a black hole. According to William Longovicia, a writer for The Atlantic, none of those theories hold any water, and even less outlandish ones often ignore the satellite data, and in some cases also the radar tracks, the aircraft systems, the air traffic control record, the physics of flight, and the basic contours of planetary geography. And of course, there are also plenty of people who have looked to capitalize on the tragedy and mystery. One Australian man claimed to have found the plane's wreckage on Google Earth, sitting intact in shallow waters. Obviously, he refuses to give up the location of this monumental find until his Kickstarter campaign for an expedition is fully funded. If we ignore the straight-up conspiracies and frauds, what are we left with? Based on everything we've learned in the last few years, experts can make some assumptions about what had happened in those final hours on board Malaysian flight MH370. We know that when the plane deviated from its planned flight path, it was an intentional move. In order to make the tight maneuvers used to turn around, the plane would have to have been operated by hand. We also know that the plane then cruised on autopilot for 6 full hours in the direction of Antarctica before it ran out of fuel. Based on the dramatic final descent, the plane reached speeds of 15,000 feet per second before abruptly crashing into the water and exploding into 1,000 pieces. Experts have assumed that the final maneuver was intentional, since it was 5 times faster than we'd expect an unassisted descent to be. In light of this, it might be a relief to know that most of the passengers and crew on board had probably passed away long before the dramatic last moments of Flight MH370. Flight data shows that shortly after the initial turn, the plane's electronic systems were disabled, including the cabin air pressurization system, and that whoever was in control of the plane executed a dramatic climb that likely accelerated the depressurization of the cabin, incapacitating and killing everyone on board. The onboard oxygen masks, which would have dropped from above in the dimly lit cabin, would have been no help at such a high altitude. Everyone outside the cockpit would have quickly passed out and died gently within minutes, with no choking or gasping for air. The cockpit, on the other hand, had an hours-long supply of oxygen. The most likely scenario to explain why Flight MH370 disappeared is a dramatic case of pilot suicide. Although the official Malaysian report indicated no problems with either of the pilots, word eventually spread that the pilot in charge, Zahari Ahmad Shah, was recently divorced and had been facing some personal issues, and he was likely clinically depressed. He also had his own flight simulator at home on which he had practiced the exact route that the fated flight took. But these are still just assumptions. There's still plenty we don't know about the tragic disappearance of Flight MH370. We still don't know for sure who was in the cockpit during the deviation, the long flight, and the ultimate end. And we don't know for sure why that person, whoever they were, decided to do what they did. We don't know why Malaysian military didn't intervene when they could, and why initial search and rescue efforts were so delayed. We also don't know what else Malaysian officials know that they haven't told us, or why they're so reluctant to share. And of course, although we know roughly where the plane was just before it ran out of fuel, we still don't know for sure exactly where the plane crashed. Sadly, we'll probably never have all of the answers to these questions, and the mystery of Malaysian Airlines Flight MH370 may never fully be solved. But the search continues for the plane's wreckage, and we may know more in the future than we know right now. The story of Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 is full of mystery. On March 8, 2014, the Boeing 777 left Kuala Lumpur for Beijing. In the coming hours, there would be odd occurrences, deception, and the disappearance of 227 passengers and 12 crew members. The plane would vanish with only ghost signals and incomplete data for investigators to follow. For almost 3 years, search missions scoured the waters and seafloor of the Indian Ocean without locating the missing plane. Now, new evidence and theories could shed some light on what actually happened to Flight 370 and the 239 souls on board. In order to understand what happened and analyze new evidence, we need to go back to the beginning, back to the very moment that Flight 370 rose into the air and set an erratic course that would lead it to mysteriously vanishing. March 8, 2014, 12:41 a.m., 2 hours before Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 goes missing. Flight attendants walk down the carpeted aisle of the Boeing 777-200ER, ensuring that everyone has their seatbelts fastened in preparation for takeoff. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah does his final pre-flight checks and confirms the airliner is ready to go with his first officer, Farik Abdul Hamid. The flight tower radios the pilots that they're clear for takeoff. Captain Zahari throttles up the engines and the plane lurches forward. The craft picks up speed as it cruises down the runway, pushing passengers back into their seats. It's extremely early in the morning, so most of the passengers are already fast asleep. A baby coos from its mother's lap as several individuals look out the windows at the lights of the airport flashing by. Flight 370 lifts off from the runway and ascends into the air. Condensation runs along the window as people close their shades and prepare for the approximately 6-hour flight to Beijing. What no one knows is that as night gives way to dawn, every single person aboard Flight 370 will go missing. 1:01 a.m., 1 hour and 40 minutes before Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 goes missing. The aircraft reaches a cruising altitude of 35,000 feet or 10,700 meters. The fasten seatbelt sign is turned off and the flight crew begins preparing snacks, drinks, and meals for the passengers. It's an overnight flight, so cabin duty should be relatively light. Some passengers stand up and stretch on the way to the bathroom. The faces of businessmen from Beijing are illuminated by their laptop screens. The snoring of sleeping passengers can be heard, complementing the roar of the plane's engines. On the ground, radar stations pick up Flight 370's signal. Everything is normal. In a little while, Flight 370 will leave Malaysian airspace and cross into Vietnam. The early hours of this morning seem like any other day. 1:07 a.m., 1 hour and 33 minutes before Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 goes missing. The Malaysian flight tower receives data from Flight 370's aircraft communication addressing and reporting system. This communications array periodically transmits data about the plane and the status of several key systems on board. This will be the last time ACARS communicates with traffic control. The tower won't notice it for 30 more minutes, but someone has turned off the ACAR system. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had a premeditated plan to fly the aircraft off course on some unknown route for some unknown reason. With Flight 370's aircraft communication addressing and reporting system turned off, the radar stations in the area no longer receive telemetry from the plane. No one on the ground knows the system has been turned off at this point in time, as there's no reason to expect anything to be wrong. However, something strange is happening aboard Flight 370, whether ground crews are aware of it or not. It's not clear if either the pilots are aware that the ACAR system has been turned off, or if one of them is the perpetrator, but this will be the first of many peculiar events that will happen over the next several hours. 1:19 a.m., 1 hour and 20 minutes before Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 goes missing. Malaysian traffic controllers receive a message from the cockpit of Flight 370. It's believed to be First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid on the headset. He does not sound agitated, and he gives no indication that there is anything wrong, even though the ACARS aboard the plane is off. This does not mean that Farik is the one who tampered with the system or that he's even aware that something is wrong, but a series of bizarre events begin after the message is sent. The voice finishes relaying a quick message and ends with "Alright, good night," indicating that he's signing off just before entering Vietnamese airspace. Traffic control thinks nothing of the message, as "good night" is often used by pilots to signal the handing over of communications from one airspace to another. The phrase is just a pleasantry that traffic controllers hear hundreds of times a week as planes leave their airspace. However, this time, "good night" are the last words anyone will ever hear from the crew and passengers aboard Flight 370. 1:21 a.m. Just as Flight 370 crosses into Vietnamese airspace over the South China Sea, someone in the cockpit flips a switch. The plane's transponder switches off. This is much more noticeable than when the aircraft communication addressing and reporting system was shut down, as the transponder constantly pings radar stations with the flight number, altitude, speed, and heading of the plane. The transponder is also a lot less complicated than turning off the ACAR system. Without the transponder on, the massive 777 is an unknown blip on the radar. Traffic controllers scan their radar screens and see dozens of little dots, however, one catches their eye. It has no flight number and isn't sending any relevant data. They keep a close eye on the aircraft to try to figure out what it is and why it isn't relaying any information. No one is overly concerned at this point. They just know something odd is happening. A soldier conducting radar surveillance at a military base in Thailand spots the blip on his screen. There's an unidentified aircraft approaching the base. There are no covert missions scheduled for that night, so this is a cause for concern. He informs his CO, and they keep tabs on the unidentified aircraft, sometime between 1:21 a.m. and 1:28 a.m. No one knows at this moment in time that the unknown aircraft showing up on the radar across Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia is Flight 370. Its transponder is still off. However, the unknown object suddenly begins to change course. A Thai radar station in the southern Surat Thani province records that the plane makes a U-turn and is now flying in the opposite direction than it had been traveling in moments before. At this point, there is no reason for anyone to suspect that Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 is the unknown craft on their screens, or that any action should be taken. This uncertainty will result in precious time being lost during the early stages of the search for the missing airliner. 1:30 a.m. Suddenly, the blip from the unknown aircraft disappears from the air traffic controller's radar in Subang, outside of Kuala Lumpur. It has vanished somewhere over the Gulf of Thailand. The last known coordinates of the plane are 065515 north and 1033443 east. It's not clear what has happened exactly, but it appears the SATCOM system has been tampered with. 1:37 a.m. Malaysian military and civilian flight radars start picking up the unknown aircraft again. Its course has been altered, and the plane is now flying southwest over the Malay Peninsula before turning northwest over the Strait of Malacca. Traffic control in Malaysia realizes that the ACARS reading from Flight 370 has not been sent and is overdue. It was supposed to be transmitted 30 minutes after the previous communication was sent at 1:07 a.m. Since this is an automated system, the traffic controllers know something is wrong. It's at this point they realize the unknown plane they've been tracking could very well be Flight 370, but there is no way to confirm this suspicion without reaching out to multiple other agencies and trying to contact the plane. In hindsight, investigators divulged that if the plane were to be hijacked or a target for terrorist activity, turning off the ACARS would be an important part of their plans. Without ACARS data being transmitted, no anomalies in the aircraft systems could be detected from the ground. The transponder being switched off is much more noticeable, but the ACARS data would have provided traffic control or anyone tracking the plane with a lot more information on what was actually happening to the aircraft at the time. 2:15 a.m., 25 minutes before Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 goes missing. Even though several civilian Malaysian radar stations are no longer tracking the unknown plane, military radar stations still have the aircraft on their screens. As it flies over the Strait of Malacca, the plane passes over the island of Pulau Perak. It continues on a westerly direction, hundreds of miles off course. As the plane continues into the Indian Ocean, fewer and fewer radar stations can track it, until only a handful still have the unknown blip on their screens. 2:22 a.m., 18 minutes before Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 goes missing. A Malaysian military radar station that's been following the aircraft's movements as it continued west loses contact over the Andaman Sea. This will be the last time anyone sees the aircraft on their radar. However, it will still be 18 more minutes before Malaysia Airlines acknowledges that Flight 370 is missing. It's not clear what the airline does during the realization that Flight 370's ACARS failed to send data, the loss of telemetry with the aircraft, and the eventual disappearance of it from radar. But it is likely that traffic controllers and their superiors had been going into damage control mode to try to keep things quiet until they had a better handle on the situation. March 8, 2014, 2:40 a.m. Air traffic controllers officially tell Malaysia Airlines that Flight 370 has disappeared. The airline scrambles all of its resources to try to locate the plane. They reach out to agencies and organizations across the region and contact the Malaysian military for help finding their missing plane. The Malaysian military hands over all raw radar data they have to US and British officials to help aid in the search and recovery of the lost plane. The race to figure out where the Boeing 777 has gone is on. Ships and aircraft are sent to the last known location of Flight 370 in the Andaman Sea. For the next hour, the preliminary search for Flight 370 begins. Military analysts and traffic controllers send messages on every possible communications channel to try to reach the missing aircraft. Malaysia Airlines calls upon traffic controllers in Vietnam, Thailand, and other parts of Malaysia to try to make sense of the situation. Information is gathered that paints an unusual picture of events. Nothing makes sense, and no one can figure out what has happened to the missing aircraft. The rest of the world has yet to be informed that Flight 370 and its 239 passengers and crew will not be landing on time. After just over an hour has passed, and it's clear the plane won't be located using conventional means, Malaysia Airlines takes things to the next level. 3:45 a.m., 1 hour and 5 minutes after Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 goes missing. A code red is issued by Malaysia Airlines to every agency that might be able to help locate the missing plane. Emergency response plans are enacted and search missions are launched. When the airline is pushed to explain why they waited over an hour to issue such an order, they tell the authorities that they were still trying to locate the plane and ensure it was actually missing. It's unclear if Malaysia Airlines had ulterior motives or if it was just incompetence that led to the slow sharing of information with other organizations. But either way, an emergency is eventually declared. For the next several hours, search and rescue missions are launched. Multiple organizations sift through the data to extrapolate where the plane might have gone. Salvage teams prepare for the worst. 6:30 a.m., 3 hours and 50 minutes after Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 goes missing. Passengers in Beijing wait for their plane to reach the gate. Flight 370 is displayed on the arrival sign, but the plane has yet to arrive. Disgruntled travelers wait for an announcement as to where their plane is and what's causing the delay. So far, Malaysia Airlines has not updated anyone about the loss of the aircraft, except for agencies and organizations that are directly involved in locating the plane. 7:24 a.m. There's still no sign of Flight 370 or any indication of what went wrong. Families are worried about their loved ones who should have landed and checked in an hour ago. The airline has received inquiries but remained silent until now. A public announcement is posted on the Malaysia Airlines Facebook page. When this happens, there is mass panic and confusion amongst friends and family members who had people on board the flight. The international community becomes aware of the search for the missing plane. Everyone waits with bated breath to learn more about the tragedy and mysterious circumstances under which Flight 370 disappeared. 8:11 a.m., 5 hours and 31 minutes after Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 goes missing. Something very strange happens. A satellite orbiting the Earth attempts a handshake or electronic connection with a plane passing below it. The satellite logs the attempted connection to the plane and relays the information to a computer database. The handshake isn't completed due to the fact that the communication systems aboard Flight 370 are offline. However, once this data comes to light, it provides a vital clue to the search and rescue parties trying to locate the aircraft. The aircraft is still in flight. Based on where the satellite is located and a number of other factors, the location of Flight 370 can be narrowed down to 2 different locations. However, since the plane is clearly still operational, the final destination of where the aircraft will touch down will need to be extrapolated. The raw satellite data is enough to confirm the plane the satellite attempted to connect with was Flight 370, which is then corroborated by the United States National Transportation Safety Board, the Federal Aviation Administration, and Britain's Air Accidents Investigation Branch. With the little information that was available at the beginning of the emergency, the initial search for Flight 370 had begun in the South China Sea. As more information comes to light, such as where the transponder had been switched off, and the resulting discovery that the unidentified plane that radar stations had been tracking all morning was in fact Flight 370, the search teams are sent off to the Strait of Malacca and the Andaman Sea. However, it isn't until satellite data from the attempted handshake is discovered that search efforts are deployed to more promising areas. March 15, 2014, 7 days after Flight 370 goes missing. The data collected by the satellite on the morning of the disappearance has finally been analyzed. All relevant organizations are notified, and the search for Flight 370 shifts to new locations. No one can be exactly sure of the location of the plane when the satellite attempted its handshake, but analysts now believe that Flight 370 could have only been on 2 possible trajectories. A series of search missions are launched into the Indian Ocean to the southwest of Australia, following the southern route the plane might have taken. Another group searches Southeast Asia, Western China, and Central Asia following the northern arc. Locating a downed plane on land can be difficult, but it's much easier than locating an aircraft on the bottom of the ocean. After days of searching, no trace of any downed aircraft can be found along the northern arc. March 24, 2014, 16 days after Flight 370 goes missing. After further analysis of the satellite data by the satellite's parent company, Inmarsat, and the UK Air Accidents Investigation Branch, it's determined that the southern arc is the most likely path that Flight 370 took, and the plane must have crashed in a remote part of the Indian Ocean. Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak announces it's highly unlikely that anyone who was aboard the plane could still be alive. The hopes of hundreds of families and friends are shattered. However, the crusade to figure out what happened and to provide answers is not over yet. April 6, 2014, 30 days after Flight 370 went missing. An Australian ship cruises through the waters of the Indian Ocean. They've been searching for any signs of Flight 370 for 2 weeks. Suddenly, the equipment on the vessel detects several acoustic pings that could possibly be from the black box or flight recorder aboard the missing Boeing 777. These signals are coming from below the waters, around 1,200 miles or 2,000 kilometers northwest of Perth, Australia. It's impossible to tell exactly where the signals are coming from, but it allows the search teams to narrow down the locations they're looking at. Around this time, new data from Inmarsat comes out. that a satellite initiated another handshake with Flight 370 around 8:19 a.m. on March 8th. The second handshake is consistent with the location where the acoustic pings are being picked up by the Australian vessel. Unfortunately, by this point, the batteries within the black box are likely on their last legs. It'll only be a matter of time before the batteries go dead and the signal is lost. Even after the signal is gone, robotic submarines are deployed to the region to scour the ocean floor for any signs of wreckage. Unfortunately, the pings had been identified over a large area, and there's no way to pinpoint the exact location. The subs continue to search underwater, even though the search area is vast. The search yields no results. The disappointment is exacerbated by the fact that tests run after the fact find that a faulty wire in the acoustic equipment aboard the ship might have been what was producing the pings. July 29, 2015, 1 year and 5 months after Flight 370 goes missing. A man walks along the beach of the French island of Réunion. He spots debris washed up on the shore. This is not unusual, as the currents running through the Indian Ocean often bring garbage adrift in the ocean to the island. However, this is different. It looks like a piece of an airplane. The man calls to others in the area and they bring the salvaged debris to the local authorities. It's identified as the right-wing flaperon of a Boeing 777. Upon further inspection by experts, it's identified as being a piece of Flight 370. The debris washed up 2,300 miles, or about 3,700 kilometers, from where the search for the missing aircraft is being conducted in the Indian Ocean. Over the next year, 26 more pieces of debris are discovered on beaches in Tanzania, Mozambique, South Africa, Madagascar, and Mauritius. The finders all claim that they're part of Flight 370, however, only 3 can be positively identified as belonging to the missing aircraft. While 17 are thought to be from Flight 370, 2 pieces seem to have come from the cabin interior, suggesting the aircraft broke apart either before or when the plane crashed into the ocean. When experts further examined the flap found in Réunion, they determined it does not appear the plane was guided into the ocean using a controlled descent. Therefore, the only other option is that Flight 370 slammed into the dark waters of the ocean and sunk to the bottom. The information gathered from confirmed debris of the aircraft allows the search area to be narrowed down even further, as some parts of the Indian Ocean do not have the currents to carry wreckage all the way to Africa. January 2017, 2 years and 10 months after Flight 370 goes missing. The Malaysian, Australian, and Chinese governments announced they will be calling off the search for Flight 370. After almost 3 years of hunting, they have come up with no tangible evidence as to where the aircraft could be. The Indian Ocean is vast. The seafloor can reach depths exceeding 5,000 meters, or 16,404 feet. An American company called Ocean Infinity receives the go-ahead from the Malaysian government to continue the search, but in May 2017, the Malaysian Transport Ministry officially decides it's time to end all search efforts. July 2018, 3 years and 4 months after Flight 370 goes missing. The Malaysian government releases its final report on Flight 370 and its disappearance. Investigations find that what happened likely wasn't the result of mechanical failure, as both the ACARS and transponder systems would not have gone down. Then there's the fact that the erratic flight path almost certainly needed to be carried out through manual inputs by a pilot. However, no clear reason is given as to why Flight 370 disappeared or where the aircraft is located. Throughout the official investigation, ideas as to what actually happened to Flight 370 spread across the globe. Conspiracy theories pop up on the internet. Entire books are written about the disappearance of the Malaysia Airlines plane. Experts weigh in on what the data said and if it was reliable. What most official reports conclude is that there just isn't enough evidence to come to a definitive conclusion on what happened to Flight 370. However, a lot has happened since the plane disappeared, and there are several theories that have made it to 2023 that could shed some light on this mystery. There are still a lot of missing facts, but sometimes it's the lack of facts that can be one of the strongest pieces of evidence in a case. Let's go down the rabbit hole and examine some of the leading theories of 2023 as to what actually happened to Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. There's one thing that time has helped with in the case of Flight 370. When news first emerged about the mysterious circumstances under which the aircraft disappeared, there were conspiracies galore. The internet was flooded with theories of alien abduction, sabotage, and military intervention. There was even some discussion and doctored footage of Flight 370 ending up in the Bermuda Triangle. And even though these theories might seem harmless, the last one included a video and a website that allowed hackers to steal people's money and identities. So this particular conspiracy ended up being very harmful. However, now that it is 2023, some of the more outlandish theories have died away. People who are still serious about finding the aircraft and bringing closure to the families and friends of those on board are still hard at work. This has allowed much more convincing and somewhat plausible explanations to emerge. One of the leading theories, and possibly the most plausible with all the information we currently have, is that one of the pilots took control of the plane, disabled all communications, and somehow was able to maintain control without the passengers, flight crew, or his co-pilot getting involved. Let's take a look at why many believe this was the case and what needed to be done for this individual to be successful. For this theory, most think Captain Zahari somehow locked his first officer out of the cockpit and turned off the systems that would allow traffic control to identify the plane. He then put on an oxygen mask and depressurized the aircraft at a height of 35,000 feet, resulting in the asphyxiation of everyone else in the plane. In this scenario, whoever was in control of the plane changed its course to fly along the borders of Malaysia and Thailand to stay clear of any military bases that an unidentified aircraft might have triggered a response from. After making it to the ocean, the pilot changed course again to a southwesterly direction and flew into the ocean, where the aircraft would never be found. But why would Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah or First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid do this? Some believe it was to take their own life in a way that would also claim the lives of hundreds of others. Using Occam's razor, which at a basic level states, the simplest answer with the least amount of variables is normally the correct one, would suggest that either Zahari or Farik took control of the plane and flew it into the Indian Ocean as being the most likely scenario. This is because it fits the evidence and data without bringing in outside variables. However, when examining the profiles of both men, the theory runs into problems. The official reports state that Captain Zahari had no known history of apathy, anxiety, or irritability. There were no significant changes in his lifestyle, interpersonal conflict, or family stress. So, what would his motivation have been? Investigators also concluded that First Officer Farik's ability and professional approach to work was reported to be good. However, mental health and depression can be complicated. Someone might not always show obvious signs that something is wrong, and a pilot taking his own life by crashing a plane is not unheard of. On March 24, 2015, the co-pilot of Germanwings Flight 9525 from Barcelona to Dusseldorf intentionally crashed his Airbus A320-211 when he was in control of it, killing the 150 people who were on board. In this case, however, the pilot had been showing signs of mental distress and had been declared unfit to work by a doctor. Both pilots of Flight 370 were given clean bills of health, and there were no warning signs to suggest they were mentally unstable. There is some evidence to suggest that Captain Zahari had practiced flying a plane into the Indian Ocean on his home flight simulator, but this is tentative at best and could very likely just have been a coincidence. What almost is certainly true, though, is that there was a person in control of Flight 370 who shut off its communication systems and manually changed the plane's course throughout the morning of March 8, 2014. Other than one of the pilots taking control, then crashing the plane, there are several hijacking theories that could shed some light on the odd events leading up to the disappearance of Flight 370. One possibility for this scenario is that either one or both of the pilots decided to hijack the plane and hold it for ransom. However, when they tried to land the craft, something went wrong. You can already see all the holes in this theory, such as no one radioed flight control or contacted Malaysia Airlines to ask for a ransom. Also, investigators determined neither of the pilots were under any financial stress or showed any changes in their behavior. And when they went over the voice recordings and conversations of the men, it was determined both pilots showed no evidence of anxiety or stress. One conclusion that came out of the investigators' report was that it's not possible to deactivate automatic deployment of the masks from the cockpit. What this means is that if the plane was hijacked, the people on board would have had ample time to try to take back the aircraft. Yet there is no indication that any type of struggle happened as far as the data is concerned. This might suggest a different type of hijacking, perhaps someone other than the pilots took control of the plane and were responsible for the disappearance of Flight 370. There were 227 passengers and 10 cabin crew aboard Flight 370. Could one of them somehow manage to take control of the plane? This seems highly unlikely, as any individual or group of bad actors would have had to somehow bypass all of the precautions and safety features implemented on major aircraft after 9/11, such as the internal locking of a cockpit door. Then there's the fact that there would have to have been hundreds of other passengers they would have to somehow subdue. Some of the people point the finger at the two Iranian men traveling on Flight 370 with stolen Italian and Australian passports as being the culprits. But upon further investigation, it was determined that these men were illegal migrants and not terrorists. Then there's the cabin crew, but again, this all seems improbable as all of them were married with families and wouldn't have had the technical expertise to turn off all the communication systems and then pilot the plane. This leads us to a more fantastical theory around hijacking, but one that could explain the erratic flight path of Flight 370. Some suggest that perhaps there was a stowaway or multiple stowaways aboard the aircraft. Supposedly, there was an underfloor area just outside the cockpit door that someone could hide in. This would mean the perpetrator needed to sneak aboard the plane before the crew got there and hide until the plane was in the air. Interestingly, from this location, it would have been possible to turn off the transponder, which we know happened. Perhaps a disgruntled employee held a long-lasting, deadly grudge against Malaysia Airlines and wanted to hold the plane for ransom or just cause some chaos. But the same inconsistencies as one of the pilots hijacking the plane for ransom arises with this scenario as well. But what if more than one stowaway or a heavily armed individual somehow managed to sneak aboard the plane? What if there was a larger and more sinister plan in place? Flight 370 being seized by terrorists is normally discredited as no organization came forward and claimed responsibility. But what if the hijacking of Flight 370 wasn't an act of terror, but one of misdirection? At the same time Flight 370 disappeared, Russia was busy annexing Crimea. Many major powers were threatening sanctions and actions against Russia during this time, and the world seemed to be rallying against Putin's decision to steal Crimea from Ukraine. However, when the news broke about the mysterious disappearance of Flight 370, the public outrage around Russia annexing Crimea died down a little bit. News cycles were now covering the search for the missing plane 24/7, and aviation experts instead of military experts were the ones being interviewed. Some have hypothesized that a covert mission either by Russian agents or hired mercenaries was carried out to seize Flight 370 and create a narrative that would distract the rest of the world from what was happening in Crimea at the time. Some have even suggested that the SATCOM aboard the plane was tampered with, and instead of the plane flying into the Indian Ocean, it was piloted along the northwestern arc and landed somewhere in Kazakhstan. Proponents of this theory claim that the plane in fact had never been found in the Indian Ocean because it's not actually there. But let's be very clear, the oceans are massive. Over 80% of the ocean has never been mapped, explored, or even seen by humans. If we strip away all the more extreme theories and stick with what we know in 2023, the most likely scenario is that one of the pilots of Flight 370 took control of the plane and flew it into the Indian Ocean, where the aircraft broke up and sank to the depths of the sea. Finding the fuselage of the plane would be like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Until we have more evidence or something more tangible to go off, what actually happened aboard Flight 370 will remain a mystery. Many believe the search to locate the remains of the aircraft should continue, to offer some closure to those who lost someone in the tragedy. However, as of right now, no one is seriously looking for the missing Boeing 777, except dedicated researchers who have devoted their lives to figuring out the truth about Flight 370. January 24, 1961, the massive B-52 Stratofortress had been in the air for over 10 hours when disaster struck. A fuel leak was discovered in the right wing. The bomber was performing a covert U.S. government airborne alert mission, part of an operation of maintaining up to 12 nuclear-armed bombers airborne and ready 24/7. Because of the leak, plans to refuel the aircraft in midair were canceled. Instead, ground control directed the bomber to fly a holding pattern off the coast of North Carolina. The plan was to fly until the aircraft had burned enough fuel to make a safe landing. But the leak kept growing and growing. The pilot realized that in 3 minutes the bomber had lost 37,000 pounds of fuel. Red alert! Ground control immediately ordered the bomber to return and land at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. Approaching the airfield, the bomber began to descend in preparation to land, but it was too late. At 10,000 feet, the bomber began shaking uncontrollably. The pilot ordered the crew to bail out. They did, abandoning in midair their payload of two 3 to 4 megaton Mark 39 thermonuclear bombs. Somewhere around 8,000 feet in altitude, the bomber caught fire, and there was an explosion. The spiraling aircraft broke up between 1,000 and 2,000 feet over the farming community of Faro, about 12 miles from Goldsboro, North Carolina. The two Mk-39 bombs were sent free-falling to the ground. Each Mk-39 is cylindrical, measuring just under 12 feet in length and weighing between 9,000 and 10,000 pounds. They're built to lay waste to a wide area. Individually, the bombs have an explosive power bigger than 3 million tons of TNT. Sadly, 3 crew members perished in the plane crash. The other 5 crew members were able to parachute and land safely. The parachute of one of the bombs deployed, and it slowly floated down. The parachute canopy tangled in a tree and the bomb landed erect, embedding its nose 18 inches into the ground. It received little impact damage. The other bomb plunged to hit the ground at around 700 miles per hour and broke apart, burying itself deep into the muddy soil of Nahunta Swamp, creating an 8-foot wide, 6-foot deep crater. For all the horror of the accident, it could have been much worse. Though the US downplayed the incident at the time, many years later declassified papers revealed the truth. Each of the M39 bombs were equipped with 4 interlocking safety mechanisms, all of which had to be triggered to explode the bomb. On the bomb that landed intact, 3 of the safety mechanisms had been activated during the fall. Only a single switch prevented the bomb from detonating. While critics have since debated exactly how close the US Air Force came to nuking North Carolina, it was fairly close. For weeks after the accident, a recovery team from the Army Corps of Engineers excavated the swampland, trying to retrieve all pieces of the second bomb. They were able to recover the parachute pack, some high explosives, a tritium bottle, and a portion of the nose. After digging some 40 feet, they were forced to declare defeat in retrieving the other pieces. Their excavating equipment kept getting stuck in the mud, and the hole kept filling with water. The thermonuclear secondary component of the bomb, which contained plutonium, uranium, and lithium salt, was left where it lay, about 180 feet underground. Unlike other nuclear disasters, no concrete barrier was poured to encase the bomb. The US government purchased a permanent easement from the David family, who owned the land, for $1,000. A few years later, Congress voted to give the Davids family an undisclosed additional settlement. Today, the North Carolina Division of Radiation Protection periodically tests the groundwater near the crash site. As of yet, no detectable radiation has been found in the area, but the radioactive elements in the bomb have extremely long half-lives. So if one or both of the bombs had detonated, what would have happened? Researchers say the yield of each bomb was more than 250 times the destructive power of the Hiroshima bomb, large enough to create a 100% kill zone with a radius of 8.5 miles. The North Carolinian countryside would have been covered in clouds of radiation, poisoning fields and the water supply for many years to come. Long after the initial explosion, sickness and thousands of deaths would have followed from exposure to radiation. Most worrying would have been the potential US response to the explosion. If the government had quickly assumed that the bomber was sabotaged, hijacked, or shot down, the US military could have retaliated, leading to a nuclear-driven World War III. Believe it or not, the Goldsboro incident is not the only time the USA has come close to accidentally nuking itself or another country. The Department of Defense has officially admitted that between 1950 and now, 32 broken arrow incidents, with 6 nuclear weapons lost and never recovered, have occurred. Some researchers claimed that the US official incident count is low, and several hundred, if not over 1,000 of accidents with nuclear weapons have occurred. On the other hand, a really high estimate of broken arrow is also questionable, as some researchers have included minor events where the weapon was not impacted at all, such as a truck having a fender bender while transporting the device in their counts. A true number of broken arrow incidents is probably somewhere in the middle of the official count and the purported count. Here are a few of the other times the US has had a serious broken arrow mishap. On July 27, 1956, after a training mission, a B-47 bomber made a difficult landing at Lakenheath Royal Air Force Station in Suffolk, England. The plane skidded out of control and slid off the runway, hitting a nuclear weapons storage facility containing 3 Mark VI nuclear bombs. The crew was killed and all 3 bombs were damaged. One even had its detonator severed from the violent impact. The bombs had to be shipped back to the US to be fixed. Investigators thought that it was a miracle the bombs didn't explode. On May 22, 1957, a B-36 bomber was transporting a Mark 17 nuclear bomb to Kirtland Air Force Base when suddenly the bomb fell through the bomb bay doors. Apparently, a safety release mechanism had been moved to the wrong position. The bomb free fell 1,700 feet and exploded as it crashed into a field near Albuquerque, New Mexico. The bomb's high explosives detonated, creating a huge crater 12 feet deep and 25 feet wide. However, thankfully, the nuclear capsule didn't detonate and was found intact. The only casualty was a cow who'd been grazing nearby. This particular bomb was estimated to have been the most powerful bomb the US ever made, at 10 megatons. If the nuclear capsule had detonated, the bomb would have had an explosive force about 625 times that of the Hiroshima bomb. Some radioactive contamination happened at the crash site. On July 29, 1957, an Air Force C-124 cargo plane carrying 3 Mark V nuclear bombs and also a nuclear core took off from Delaware, planning to fly to Europe. The plane experienced mechanical difficulties and was forced to drop 2 of the Mark V nuclear bombs in the Atlantic Ocean near Atlantic City, New Jersey. One bomb was dumped 50 miles from the coast and the other 75 miles. While the removable plutonium capsules that give the bombs their nuclear punch weren't installed, each bomb carried a ton of high explosives. Thankfully, the bombs didn't explode. While the military searched for the bombs, they weren't found. As far as it's publicly known, the bombs are still somewhere out there, being corroded by salt water and possibly leaking into the ocean. On February 5, 1957, the Air Force was holding a series of training exercises off of Tybee Island near Savannah, Georgia. During a simulated combat mission, a B-47 bomber carrying a 12-foot-long, 7,600-pound Mark 15 bomb collided mid-air at 39,000 feet with an F-86 fighter plane. The F-86 crashed, but the pilot was able to safely eject. The bomber had severe damage and attempted to land at Hunter Air Force Base with the weapon on board, but wasn't able to. Fearing possible detonation in the event of a crash, the aircrew jettisoned the bomb at 7,200 feet. They were able to later land safely. Though the armed forces spent weeks searching for the bomb, even using divers and sonar, they were unable to find it. The bomb remains buried in the silt at the bottom of the Wassaw Sound. The Air Force maintains that while the bomb could have had a large conventional explosion from the 400 pounds of high explosives it carried, it didn't have a nuclear capsule installed and therefore wouldn't cause a nuclear explosion. However, while testifying to Congress, the Assistant Secretary from the Department of Defense claimed that the bomb was complete with a nuclear capsule installed. In either case, the bomb had weapons-grade uranium, and if it had exploded, radioactive material would have been forcefully spread. If the explosion was nuclear, the radioactive fallout would have been bigger. Since the accident, the area has been monitored for radioactivity. While higher than normal levels of radioactivity have been found in the area, further testing determined that monazite, a harmless mineral in the sand, is actually naturally radioactive. On December 5, 1965, the aircraft carrier the USS Ticonderoga was traveling about 70 miles off the coast of Okinawa, Japan. During a training exercise, an A-4E Skyhawk loaded with a 1-megaton B-43 nuclear bomb rolled off the deck. The aircraft, pilot, and live bomb were lost in 16,200 feet of ocean. Though ships searched for hours after the incident, no trace of the pilot or plane was ever found. The incident was kept secret until 1981, when the Navy released a brief statement saying that the plane was carrying a nuclear bomb, but the accident occurred 500 miles from land. It wasn't until '89 that the truth was revealed. The Japanese were outraged to find that a bomb with a yield 70 times greater than the bomb dropped in Hiroshima was lost so close to shore. Furthermore, Japanese law bans ships carrying nuclear weapons from sailing in its territorial waters or calling on its ports, and the U.S. clearly violated that policy, although they've never admitted to having done so. On January 21, 1968, a B-52 was en route from Plattsburgh Air Force Base, New York, to Thule Air Force Base in Greenland, when a fire broke out in the navigator's compartment. The plane ended up crashing on sea ice in North Star Bay about 7 miles southeast of the base. 6 of the 7 crew members were able to eject and survived the crash. The high explosives on the bomber detonated upon impact. While the 4 B-28 Fi thermonuclear bombs on board didn't explode, they ruptured and dispersed radioactive material, which resulted in contamination. The US and Denmark immediately launched Project Crested Ice, an intensive cleanup and environmental restoration operation. Over 4 months, workers battled Greenland's harsh winter weather to remove approximately 273,000 cubic feet of contaminated ice, snow, water, and debris. The contaminated material was transported for burial at nuclear dumps in the US. Beginning in 1957, about 10 years after this accident, Denmark had instituted a nuclear-free zone policy. The Danish public protested over what they saw was a violation of their country. The Danish and American governments claimed the bomber was not on a routine mission and that it had diverted to Greenland because of a one-time emergency. At the time, the Thule accident was the latest in a string of several aircraft accidents involving nuclear weapons. In order to mollify international outrage, Operation Chrome Dome, an airborne alert program, was ended, and the U.S. Secretary of Defense decided that U.S. aircraft would only fly with live nuclear weapons aboard during a crisis. In the 1990s, declassified papers showed that the U.S. regularly flew nuclear-armed flights over Greenland and that the Danish Prime Minister at the time had implicitly allowed it. Also, later declassified documents suggested that during the Thule incident, the secondary stage of one of the bombs sank to the seabed and couldn't be retrieved. Both revelations caused widespread protests in Denmark. In the 2000s, workers involved in the cleanup operation sought and were granted compensation from the U.S. government for radiation-related illnesses. These Broken Arrow incidents are just the tip of the iceberg. However, it's not just the U.S. Russia and a few other countries have experienced and often hushed up or downplayed nuclear weapons accidents too. In most cases, the accidents caused the militaries or countries involved to improve upon the rules for handling nuclear devices. The Dyatlov Pass Incident, the Black Dahlia Murder, the real identity of the Zodiac Killer. The world is filled with unsolved mysteries to keep us up at night, turning possibilities over in our heads. But some of the most disturbing mysteries out there are the stories of ordinary people vanishing into thin air. Maybe they went for a hike or a bike ride, maybe they went on a cruise, or perhaps they were simply spending a quiet night alone at home. Whatever the reason, they disappeared and were never seen again. We always assume it could never happen to us, but then again, didn't the missing people likely assume the exact same thing? It's the stuff of nightmares, these unsolved disappearances, and yet we just can't seem to look away. We theorize, we investigate, and we compile lists into YouTube videos. Today we're delving deeper into some of the most disturbed stories of people going missing. If you've ever been up late at night perusing lists of the most disturbing real images ever captured on film, chances are you've seen a photograph of a young woman and a boy bound and gagged with black tape over their mouths. But you may not know the context. This haunting image has been connected to the disappearance of a young woman named Tara Calico. It was the morning of September 20th, 1988, and 19-year-old Tara Calico left her home in Valencia County, New Mexico to go for a bike ride. She took the same route every day along New Mexico State Road 47. Tara's mother, Patty, sometimes rode with her, but after an incident with a car driving aggressively close to her, Patty had been leaving Tara to take the ride by herself. She suggested that Tara bring some mace with her for self-defense, but Tara didn't think she needed it. After all, she'd been taking that same route for years with no issues. As she left, Tara joked to her mother that she'd better come out and look for her if she wasn't back by noon. After all, she had a tennis date with her boyfriend at 12:30 and she didn't want to miss it. It was only a joke, but when noon rolled around, Tara was still not home. She had disappeared in broad daylight, on the route that she had biked for years. Patty drove up and down the route that afternoon, searching for any sign of the missing girl, but she couldn't find a thing. She called the police and a search party was put together, but neither her bike nor Tara herself were found. A few witnesses remembered seeing Tara, and a couple recalled a light-colored pickup truck driving down the road at the same time, but no one saw any signs of foul play. The only signs that Tara had ever been there at all were pieces of her broken Walkman, along with a cassette tape found on the ground. At first, police suspected the girl was a runaway. But according to John Doyle, Tara's stepfather, as well as Patty, Tara was a happy girl with no reason to do something like that. The couple was heartbroken, waiting for any evidence that might lead them to Tara. On June 15, 1989, nearly 9 months after Tara first vanished, an unlikely, disturbing clue surfaced. A Polaroid picture was found in a convenience store parking lot in Port St. Joe, Florida, 1,500 miles from where Tara had been riding her bike. In the photo, a teenage girl and a young boy were lying on sheets and a pillow, bound and with duct tape over their mouths. The woman who'd found the picture called the police and described a white Toyota van that had been parked in that spot before she arrived. Its driver was a man in his 30s with a mustache. Police attempted to catch the vehicle with a roadblock but could not find it or its driver. The photograph quickly gained national prominence and caught the attention of the friends of Patty, who believed it could be Tara. There was some debate as to whether or not the girl in the photograph was Tara, but certain details led Patty to believe it was. The girl had a discolored streak on her thigh, just like a scar Tara had gotten in a car accident. There was a V.C. Andrews paperback next to her, one of Tara's favorite writers. Authorities weighed in next and were divided on the subject. The Los Alamos National Laboratory did not believe it was Tara, while the FBI could not reach a definitive conclusion. Meanwhile, Scotland Yard in the United Kingdom agreed that the girl in the photo was Tara. No matter who the girl in the photo was, the picture had certainly been taken recently, no later than May of that same year. Soon after, the young boy in the Polaroid was identified as 9-year-old Michael Henley, whose family came forward. Michael disappeared while on a hunting trip with his father in New Mexico in April 1988. Now his family was convinced their son was in this photo. However, in 1990, Michael's body was found 7 miles from the campsite where he disappeared. He had died from exposure before the Polaroid had ever been taken. To this day, Tara Calico's disappearance remains unsolved. In 2008, the Valencia County Sheriff claimed to know what happened to Tara. He said that 2 men, teenagers at the time, were following Tara on her bike when an accident occurred. In a panic, they disposed of her body and covered it up. However, with no body, no arrest could be made. There has been little to support these claims since 2008. Over the years, some additional Polaroid photographs have appeared which could have depicted Tara Calico. One, a blurry photo of a girl's face with tape over her mouth, found near a construction site in Montecito, California, and taken sometime after May 1989, compelled Patty. She believed this could be an additional image of her daughter. The other, a picture of a woman sitting next to a man on an Amtrak train, bound and with her eyes covered, was taken around February of 1990. Patty did not believe this photo to be of Tara. More than 30 years after her disappearance, Tara's case remains unsolved, with nothing to go on other than a smattering of uncertain evidence and a haunting Polaroid picture. In June of 2023, however, there was a ray of light through all these exceedingly dark clouds. The Valencia County Sheriff's Office announced they'd made a break in the case, with Sheriff Denise Vigil saying, "At this time, law enforcement believes there is sufficient evidence to submit this investigation to the District Attorney's Office for review of potential charges. Currently, the identities and specifics of the persons of interest are sealed by the court and will remain so until a court order otherwise. We're still waiting for updates on that one." When we think of disappearances, we tend to assume that they occurred somewhere remote, the dense forests of a national park, or a ship in the middle of an ocean. But sometimes someone can vanish from within the walls of a place that millions of people consider holy, sacred, and presumably safe. Emanuela Orlandi, a 15-year-old daughter of a Vatican official, left home to attend her flute lesson on June 22, 1983. She reached class safely and called her sister after it ended, but she never made it back home. She was declared missing the next day, and the search began for the girl who had gone missing in the Vatican. On June 25th, a tip was called in describing a girl with a flute and wearing clothing matching Orlandi's at the time of her disappearance. According to his story, she was in Rome, calling herself Barbarella, and had run away from home to sell Avon. This was a dream that she had previously mentioned to her sister. Another tip came in on June 28th in which a man told authorities he had met a girl named Barbara, a runaway who he had encountered at a bar near the music school where Orlandi's flute lessons were given. However, she could not be tracked down, and the theories surrounding the case began to get stranger and stranger. Other tips poured in, claiming that a Turkish terrorist group called the Grey Wolves had kidnapped Orlandi as part of a conspiracy to hold her hostage and exchange her for an assassin. But there were also theories involving the mafia presence in the surrounding area, as well as the Vatican itself. The ex-girlfriend of Enrico de Pettis, leader of the Rome-based crime syndicate Banda del Magliana, claimed that he had once confided in her about kidnapping Orlandi with plans to hold her for ransom. However, there's never been concrete evidence linking him to the disappearance. Another extremely upsetting theory comes from Father Gabriele Amorth, the Vatican's chief exorcist. He claims that Orlandi was taken as part of a plot by the Vatican, police, and local lawmakers to sexually traffic young women. He said on the subject, "This was a crime with a sexual motive. Parties were organized with the Vatican gendarme acting as the recruiter of the girls. This network involved diplomatic personnel from a foreign embassy to the Holy See. I believe Emanuela ended up as a victim of this circle." None of these theories have been linked to definitive proof. Since her disappearance, her family has been primarily focused on locating her body so they can have some sort of closure. In 2019, the Orlandi family's lawyer, Laura Scrow, received a bizarre letter containing a photograph of a tomb beneath the Vatican and the ominous instructions, "Look where the angel is pointing." This referred to the marble angel placed there. The tomb was searched, but no human remains were found. In fact, the tomb was completely empty. According to Vatican spokesperson Alessandro Gassotti, the Vatican's cooperation with this part of the investigation came as a surprise to Orlandi's sister, Pietro. According to him, when he asked Pope Francis for help in 2013, the only response he received was that his sister was in heaven. The Orlandi family is determined to continue the search as long as they can, until they can find answers about what happened to Emanuela all those years ago. From holy places to cursed places, some locations just seem to be a magnet for misfortune. Most of us have heard of the Bermuda Triangle, but how about the Bennington Triangle? The term, coined in 1992 during a radio appearance by New England author Joseph A. Citro, refers to an area in southwestern Vermont in which several people went missing between 1945 and 1950. The name refers to Bennington, Vermont and Bennington College and draws a deliberate parallel between the disappearances there and the ships that vanished in the Bermuda Triangle. One of the most infamous disappearances that occurred in the Bennington Triangle is that of a young woman named Paula Weldon. Paula Weldon, 18 years old, was a sophomore at Bennington College, where she lived an ordinary, quiet student life until one brisk winter day on December 1, 1946. After working a double shift at her job in the university's dining hall, she told her roommate, Elizabeth Johnson, that she wanted to go out and take a hike on the Long Trail, a 5-mile portion of a 272-mile trail, this section of which runs up Glastonbury Mountain. It was about 2:45 p.m., cold out and likely to get colder as the sun set that evening, and Paula was dressed in blue jeans, a red parka with a fur-lined hood, and a pair of topsider sneakers. As she prepared to leave, Paula called out to Johnson, "I'm all through with studies, I'm taking a long walk." Those would be the last words Paula's roommate would ever hear her speak. Shortly after Paula left her room, she was spotted by Danny Fager, the owner of a local gas station across the street from the college. 15 minutes later, a local man named Louis Knapp saw a girl in a red parka hitchhiking along Route 67A near the college. Realizing she was likely a Bennington student in need of a ride, he stopped to pick her up. Aside from the red coat and the girl's clumsiness, she tripped on the way to his truck and he advised her to be careful. She told him that she was on her way to hike a long trail, and so he dropped her off on Route 9 near the trail's entrance, before pulling into his driveway at home. A few minutes after Knapp dropped Paula off, his daughter went outside, but there was no sign of the hitchhiker. This struck her as odd since the flat Route 9 allowed anyone to see a half a mile in either direction. But Knapp and his daughter were not the last people to see Paula. Just before 4 p.m., Paula encountered Ernest Whitman, the owner of a nearby cabin in Bickford Hollow. She reportedly asked him how far she could go on the trail. He replied it's 4 miles to the fork, before warning her that she was dressed too lightly for the winter weather. Whether she didn't hear him or simply chose not to respond, Paula said nothing and continued along the trail. That was quite possibly the last time anyone ever spoke to Paula Weldon. As the afternoon turned to evening and evening turned to night, Paula's roommate Elizabeth began to wonder what was taking her so long. She brushed off the worry at first, convincing herself that perhaps Paula was having a late night studying somewhere else on campus. But when the morning came, and Paula still wasn't back, Elizabeth contacted the college president, Louis Webster Jones. He phoned Paula's parents and asked them a question that chilled them both to the bone. Had Paula gone home for the weekend? She most certainly had not, and Paula's mother fainted from shock of the news that her daughter was missing. Paula's father immediately left the Weldon home in Connecticut and traveled to Bennington, where he organized a search party that included students from Bennington and Williams College, as well as local members of the community. College President Jones canceled classes to aid in the search, sending groups of 20 along the long trail where they dropped handfuls of confetti to signal to other groups that a given area had already been checked. After a day of searching and no new leads, Mr. Weldon called in New York and Connecticut State Police. At the time, Vermont had no state police force but did have a state investigator who offered a $5,000 reward for any information on Paula's whereabouts. As the investigation continued, several potential leads surfaced, but they all brought more questions than answers. A waitress in Fall River, Massachusetts claimed to have served an upset young woman matching Paula's description. She was accompanied by a man around 25 years old who appeared drunk and angry. Mr. Weldon believed that a boyfriend of Paula's must have been responsible for her disappearance, but no conclusive proof could be found. A year after the disappearance, a woman named Mary Weldon was spotted at a campground in South Carolina, but after speaking with her on the phone, Mrs. Weldon confirmed that she was not her daughter. 9 years after Paula went missing, a lumberjack approached authorities, claiming that he was in Bickford Hollow when Paula vanished, and that he knew where her body was buried. The man later admitted to lying. Then in 1968, a body was finally found, a skeleton buried near where Paula disappeared. However, an examination on the remains determined that they were far too old to belong to Paula. To this day, Paula Weldon's disappearance has never been solved. But Paula was not the only victim of the Bennington Triangle. In December 1949, 68-year-old James Tedford vanished from a bus headed to Bennington. He briefly left the bus in Burlington, where he chatted with an old friend, then returned to his journey. When the bus reached Bennington, Tedford's belongings and the bus schedule were on it, but he was not. He was never found. In October 1950, 8-year-old Paul Jepson was with his mother at the Bennington Town dump when he walked away from their truck. As soon as she noticed his absence, she called the police. Bloodhounds followed the boy's scent to the highway before the trail suddenly went cold. In the middle of the road near Glastonbury Mountain, he was never found. Only a few weeks later, Frida Langer, age 53, was camping with her family. She and a cousin went swimming in a stream when Langer left to retrieve dry clothes from the campsite. However, she never reached the campsite. Unlike the other Bennington Triangle disappearances, Langer's body was found 7 months later. Her cause of death ruled an accidental drowning. And in November 1950, 16-year-old Martha Jeanette Jones was reported missing. She had been missing for a month, but her family had assumed she was at seminary school, and her school assumed she was at home with her family. Over the course of 5 years, 6 people vanished near Bennington or Glastonbury. Only one of their bodies was ever found. The rest are still a mystery. People have blamed everything from Bigfoot to UFOs to a serial killer to simply the confusing nature of the long trail itself. But it is unlikely we'll ever know for sure. Cave diving is regarded as one of the most dangerous underwater hobbies, and it stands to reason that it would come with its fair share of casualties. But rarely do cave divers vanish into the depths without a trace, and yet that's exactly what happened to Ben McDaniel when he went diving in the Vortex Spring Cave on Wednesday, August 18, 2010. Vortex Spring contains the largest diving facility in the state of Florida, where divers of all levels can dive in the upper areas of the water. However, more experienced divers are inclined to explore the cave. Below the spring, there's a 9 by 12 feet opening to a cavern, which extends to a depth of 115 feet. There, the entrance to the cave can be found blocked by a steel rebar gate. In order to enter this section, you must show your cave certification to the dive shop, who will lend out a key to the gate. Ben did not have a cave diving certification. The dive shop employees believed that Ben had been forcing the gate open for some time and diving in the cave anyway. However, he had been doing so safely and they were inclined to allow him to continue. On the day of his disappearance, one of the dive shop employees accompanied Ben down to the gate and opened it for him. He watched Ben proceed into the cave and out of sight, never to be seen again. The dive shop employees left for the night, and the next morning Ben's truck was still there in the parking lot. No one really noticed it at the time, but by Friday they noticed that the truck was still there, and no one had seen Ben since Wednesday. They sensed something was very wrong and they called the police. The police searched Ben's truck and found his wallet, phone, and dive logs, which included a map of the areas of the cave he had already explored. When the police went by Ben's family's beach house, his dog was inside and had not been fed for 2 days. This was more than enough evidence to suggest Ben had drowned inside the cave. As word of Ben's disappearance spread through the community, cave divers volunteered to join in the search of what they assumed would be the inevitable recovery of Ben's body. But the case would prove to be far murkier than that. The divers searched the large tunnels and small tunnels to no avail, then began to inspect smaller crevices and fissures, assuming Ben had accidentally wedged himself into a crevice and drowned. However, they found nothing. Well, not nothing. They did find some incredibly confusing evidence in the form of Ben's air tanks discovered in the outer cavern area and inside of the cave. All 3 of the tanks discovered contained regular air. This was highly unusual, as at least one of the tanks should have contained a different gas mixture in order to prevent nitrogen narcosis. Because Ben had already investigated so much of the cave, he should have already known better than to dive with tanks full of ordinary air. In fact, he likely would not have survived his previous dives without the particular gas mixture required for cave dives of that depth. After this discovery, with still no sign of Ben's body, the search party reached out to legendary diver Ed Sorensen, a highly skilled cave diver with specialization in recovery. Ed made 3 dives covering 1,700 feet of the cave, at least 200 feet more than Ben had mapped. But in spite of his efforts and his skills, he found nothing. There was nobody there, no more equipment. He even searched for signs of increased fish activity, which could indicate the presence of decaying organic matter, like a corpse, somewhere in the cave. But there was nothing. The lack of evidence extended to the environment itself. There were no markings on the walls or silt disturbances, which would be expected in the event that Ben had squeezed into some of the tighter, more dangerous tunnels. Not only that, but Ben was markedly larger than Ed in both height and weight. Ed suggested that it was highly unlikely that Ben would have been able to make it further into the caves than he had. It just didn't make any sense. Unwilling to accept this lack of closure, Ben's parents financed a remotely operated underwater vehicle, which was used to search the cave. But the vehicle was unable to progress any further than the human divers had. It was beginning to look like Ben wasn't in the cave at all, but if he wasn't in the cave, then where did he go? Police brought in the 2 divers who saw him the night of his disappearance and questioned them, even giving them a lie detector test out of suspicions that he had drowned the night before and they had removed his body to avoid attracting attention. However, they passed the test and the theory was shelved. Some investigators suggested that Ben had washed out through one of the spring outlets, but police searched the swamps that the spring flowed into and found nothing. They also searched other nearby bodies of water, including Blue Creek, Sandy Creek, and the Choctawhatchee River, but again, nothing was found. The waters were tested for bacteria which would spike in the event of a decomposing body, but no bacteria increases were detected. Another suggested theory was that Ben had deliberately faked his own disappearance in search of a fresh start. He had experienced financial hardship in the past in the form of significant debts. However, both his parents and girlfriend disputed this, claiming that he had seemed positive and optimistic as of late. As years have passed and no new evidence surfaced, Ben's parents began to suspect foul play. They hired a private investigator who looked into the dive shop and its workers. The investigator found that the owner of the shop was facing criminal charges for the assault and kidnapping of a temporary employee who owed him money. However, by the time this was uncovered, the owner had died after falling down a flight of stairs. If something did happen between him and Ben, that story likely died with him. There's still no sign of Ben McDaniel or any indication that there ever will be. Perhaps he is somewhere in the cave, in a deep dark crevice that no one has been able to uncover yet. Perhaps he faked his death. Perhaps he was murdered in a debt collection gone wrong. We'll likely never know the truth. Diving deep beneath the surface of the water can be dangerous, but even aboard the deck of a cruise ship, disaster can still strike. At least it did for Amy Lynn Bradley in 1998. On March 21st of that year, Amy Lynn and her brother Brad, as well as their parents Ron and Iva, boarded the ship Rhapsody of the Seas in Puerto Rico. The ship would travel to Aruba and then on to Curacao. On the night of March 23rd, Amy and her brother went dancing to a live band in the ship's nightclub before turning in for the night at around 1 a.m. That was the last time Brad ever saw his sister. At about 5:30 a.m., Ron Bradley looked out at the balcony of the family's cabin and saw Amy there. He thought nothing of it, but when he looked back, she was gone. Worried, he went to her room and found that she wasn't there. The family looked all over the ship but could find no sign of Amy. The cruise ship crew refused to page Amy Lynn until the ship was docked at port, afraid of upsetting other passengers. The crew agreed to search common areas but refused to search staff or passenger cabins. Meanwhile, the Bradley family was frantic. It was possible that Amy Lynn had fallen overboard and drowned, but the family insisted this was unlikely. She was a trained lifeguard and known for her strong swimming ability, and no one could find any signs of a body in the water around the ship. Even more concerningly, a witness reported seeing Amy near the dance club at around 6 a.m. with a man named Alistair Douglas, who she had been seen dancing with at the club the night before. He denied this. Though the case was far from closed, the story didn't end there. In August of 1998, 5 months after Amy Lynn's disappearance, 2 Canadian tourists reported seeing a woman matching her description on the beach. The woman even had the same tattoos. Then, in 1999, a Navy officer met a woman in a brothel in Curacao who asked him for help, telling him that her name was Amy Lynn Bradley. He didn't report it until he saw her face in People magazine. 6 years later, a woman claimed to have met Amy Lynn in a department store bathroom in Barbados, where she introduced herself as Amy from Virginia. In 2005, the Bradleys received an upsetting email from an organization that looks for sex trafficking victims on pornographic websites. The email contained a photo of a woman in her underwear, lying on a bed. The woman appeared to be Amy. To this day, Amy's disappearance remains an ongoing investigation, with the FBI offering an award of up to $25,000 for any information that might lead them to her whereabouts. The disappearances we've covered so far have been all individuals who disappeared while on their own. However, solitude isn't always a prerequisite for a missing persons case. In 2009, all 3 members of a family disappeared from their home with no suggestions of where they could have gone. On October 8, 2009, Bobby Dale Jamison, his wife Cheryl Lynn, and their 6-year-old daughter Madison vanished from their home in Eufaula, Oklahoma. A few days later, the police found their pickup truck in Latimer County about an hour's drive from their house. In the truck, the police found IDs, wallets, phones, Cheryl Lynn's purse, their still-alive family dog, and $32,000 in cash. This was especially strange given that Bobby Dale and Cheryl Lynn were both on disability at the time of their disappearance, and no one knew where they could have gotten their hands on that much money or what they were intending to do with it. More importantly, where had the family gone? There were no clear signs of them being forced out of the car by someone, but that didn't mean there was no foul play. A search party began to search the woods around the area where the truck was found, but no signs of the family turned up. The case went cold and remained that way until November 16, 2013. 4 years after the truck turned up, 3 miles from where it was found, some hunters discovered the partial skeletal remains of 2 adults and 1 child. They were examined, and it was determined that these skeletons belonged to the missing Jamison family. However, due to the advanced state of decomposition, the cause of death was not identifiable. The case was reopened, and even though the police now had bodies to fill in some of the blanks, more questions kept popping up. They discovered security footage from outside the Jamison family home. In it, the couple was going back and forth between the house and the truck packing their things. The police also discovered that before their disappearance, Bobby Dale had spoken to his pastor about a fear that the house was haunted. He described 2 to 4 ghosts on the roof of the home. There were also rumors of a satanic Bible purchased by Cheryl Lynn and claims from Cheryl Lynn's mother, Connie, that the Jamisons had become involved with a cult. This particular theory has never had any evidence to back it up, but other unsettling theories have surfaced over the years. Police discovered an 11-page letter from Cheryl Lynn to Bobby, in which she was incredibly angry with him over a variety of things. The letter caused them to float the theory that Bobby Dale had driven the family out to the woods and killed his wife and daughter, then himself. However, there was no proof of this theory, and it would not explain the presence of the massive amount of cash found in the truck. Another theory involved Bobby Dale's father, Bob Dean. Bobby Dale had filed an order of protection against his father, citing threats of violence and even murder from him toward the family. However, Bob Dean died 2 months after the Jamison family disappeared due to a long history of health problems. Jack Jamison, his brother, insisted that Bob Dean had spent the time leading up to the disappearance primarily in hospitals or rest homes and would not have been able to play a part in it. In spite of the abundance of theories, there are still no answers in the case of the Jamison family. Another disappearance involving multiple victims is that of the infamous Fort Worth trio. 17-year-old Rachel Terlitza, 14-year-old Renee Wilson, and 9-year-old Julie Ann Mosley were out doing some last-minute Christmas shopping on December 23, 1974, at Seminary South Mall. At about noon, Rachel parked her car near the Sears in the East Lot. Renee planned to be home by 4 for a Christmas party, while Julie's mother was expecting her by 6. But when both of these times passed and the girls were not home, their parents became concerned. The car was still found in the lot, locked, with newly purchased items in the back seat. Police theorized the girls had run away, but their families could think of no reason why they would have done so. The following day, a letter arrived at the home of Rachel and her husband, Tommy. The letter claimed to be from Rachel, but curiously was addressed to Thomas A. Terlitza rather than Tommy. Rachel never called him Thomas. The stamp on the envelope had been canceled, and the zip code of the cancellation was blurred. The letter read, "I know I'm going to catch it, but we just had to get away. We're going to Houston. See you in about a week. The cars in Sears upper lot. Love, Rachel." The FBI analysis of the handwriting was inconclusive, but Tommy insisted that Rachel did not write the letter. 1 week later, the girls had not returned in spite of the letter's promise. 6 weeks after the disappearance, Julie's mother received a phone call from an unidentified girl who called her Mama. She believed this was her missing daughter. In spite of decades of searching and false hopes in the form of human remains, later determined not to belong to the trio, their fate is still unknown. The truth can be horrifying, but as we see time and time again, the unknown is often even scarier. And to wrap up the proceedings, we have a disturbing story of a disappearance that would forever change how we respond to disappearances like this. The heart-wrenching case of 8-year-old Cherie Mahan, who disappeared in 1985 after getting off the school bus just 50 feet from her rural Pennsylvania home. When Mahan disembarked from the bus at 4:10 p.m. on February 22, 1985, she waved goodbye to her friends who were being picked up by one of their mothers, and was last seen by a bystander heading back in the direction of her home. The closest the police had to a lead on her possible kidnapper was an old van with a mural of a skier on a snow-capped mountain painted on the side. Despite an extensive search and an almost $40,000 reward, Mahan was never found. She was declared legally dead in 1998, despite the police never discovering a body. Why does the disappearance of Cherie Mahan mark such a shift in missing people? Her photo was the first one to be featured in a poster campaign featuring the words, "Have you seen me?" a new iconic and infamous style of poster, especially for missing children. In 2011, Pennsylvania State Police Officer Robert McGraw said, "I believe Cherie was abducted by someone she knows very well, and I believe this person had the ability to basically lure Cherie into their vehicle without her giving it a second thought prior to her disappearance. I can't imagine if that was my child. I can't imagine the pain her mother must wake up with every day." And we know this is true. In 2019, Cherie's mother, Janice McKinney, was quoted saying, "I just wish someone would come forth and tell me what happened. That's all I pray for, all the time, is just to know." This very lack of closure is why the pain and fascination behind cases like these can endure, even decades after the victims first vanish without a trace. June 23, 2015. A 14-year-old American boy, Perry, sends a message via Instagram to a friend. "Me and Austin are crossing to the Bahamas tomorrow. Come with us." Soon after, one of his friends receives a message on Snapchat that reads, "We're effed." 8 months later, their 19-foot vessel was found capsized off the coast of Bermuda. Strangely, the engine switch was in the off position. Even more strangely, an iPhone 6 was found, but someone had switched it off before the battery had run out. The contents of that iPhone might just solve what's become a perplexing mystery. The boys were nowhere to be seen. Like many of the 50 other ships and 20 planes that have gone missing over the last century in the area known as the Bermuda Triangle, these 2 young men completely vanished. What happened to them? We'll talk about this later. For now, we'll just say that these boys might have shared a similar fate to hundreds of people who seemingly vanished into thin air in this area of the world. After the boys disappeared, Bermuda Triangle conspiracy theories flourished once more, flooding online forums and comment sections. Still, the urban legends of vanishing ships and planes go back to a time long before people communicated on digital platforms. The Bermuda Triangle conspiracy theory began when a writer named George X. Sand wrote a magazine article for Fate magazine, a US-based magazine that featured stories on paranormal phenomena. The article in question was titled, "Sea Mystery at Our Back Door." It starts by talking about a 350-foot ship named Sandra, which set off from Savannah, Georgia in 1950 with the intention of delivering 12 men and 300 tons of insecticide to Puerto Cabello, Venezuela. Sands wrote, "It would not be delivered, not ever." A search for the vessel would prove fruitless, with the case, like many others of the future, being called unsolved. Sands wrote, "It became but another baffling incident in a strange series of marine disappearances at the doorstep of the United States." He said they all took place in what he called a watery triangle bounded roughly by Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. The triangle has no exact boundary line, but it's generally thought to be made up of 500,000 to 1,510,000 square miles of water. One of the more notable cases that Sands brought up in his article was the disappearance of Flight 19, an unarguably confounding tale that involved 5 TBM-type aircraft that took off from the Naval Air Station in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, on December 5, 1945, for a training exercise. 14 men on those 5 planes vanished into thin air, a story that shocked a nation and embarrassed the U.S. Navy. Leading the bombing and navigation exercise for the new recruits was Navy Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor. He had around 2,500 flying hours behind him and was very familiar with this type of aircraft, while the young pilots he was leading each had around 300 flight hours of training. This was the last flight exercise that the trainees needed to complete before they graduated. They ran into trouble sometime during the operation, with Taylor's last message being, "All planes close up tight, we'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we'll all go down together." He earlier radioed about having problems, explaining, "Both of my compasses are out. I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm over land, but it's broken. I'm sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down and I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale." The mysterious part isn't that the planes ran into trouble. What's mysterious is that as the last message was received only 4 hours and 10 minutes after takeoff, Taylor and his trainees could not have gotten that far from base. Taylor was wrong about his assumed position, but the fact that all 5 planes vanished so close to home is indeed confounding. What's more confounding is that after learning that Flight 19 was in trouble, 2 PBM Mariner flying boats were dispatched from the base at Banana River in Melbourne, Florida, now called Patrick Air Force Base. Only one returned. Just less than 30 minutes after takeoff, one of the PBMs, Trainer 49, reported that they were close to the point at which Flight 19 was assumed to be located. That communication was the last thing anyone ever heard from the plane. Like Flight 19, it vanished, as did the 13 crew on board. It was a head-scratching time for the Navy, and it would be head-scratching time for decades to come for the US government. So how do so many planes just disappear, with not one single part of them ever being found? It's not like the military didn't put any effort into finding them. The US launched one of the biggest search operations ever at that point in history. The Navy ordered 248 planes to search for any remnant of the lost aircraft. 18 Navy ships looked for the wreckage, as did a whole bunch of merchant vessels and a few civilian vessels. Between them, they covered 200,000 square miles of the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. The Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale Museum wrote many years later, scouring practically every mile of open water off the coast were 6 planes from the 3rd Air Force, 120 planes from the Navy Air Advanced Training Command, and several aircraft from the Air Transport Command, the Boca Raton Army Airfield, the Coast Guard, and the RAF in Nassau. In addition, dozens of Navy and Coast Guard surface craft joined in the hunt. Taylor was later found guilty of mental aberration for leading his trainees to their deaths, but his dear mother was less than pleased with that outcome. She led a subsequent investigation into the tragedy, after which in 1947, the Navy admitted that Taylor was not responsible for loss of lives and naval aircraft, leaving the whole situation with no agreed-upon conclusion. Importantly, as far as this show goes today, this has happened at a time when people in the USA were obsessed with unidentified flying objects, UFOs, with numerous reports in the late 40s of possible alien spacecraft flying erratically at high speeds above American soil. The public read stories about men in black suits and what were described as flying saucers. The sightings always seemed to happen in rural areas, as if the aliens liked the peace and quiet of the rugged countryside. A comedian later joked, the fact that they cross galaxies and always end up in places like Fife, Alabama, this was certainly a strange phenomenon. The Roswell UFO incident was one part of what's now called the flying disc craze of 1947. In the years to come, there were numerous more sightings of UFOs. In some cases, little green men were said to walk out of the spaceships. In what became known as the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter, 5 adults and 7 children showed up at a police station in Kentucky in 1955, each person looking sincerely distressed, saying they had a 4-hour gun battle with green guys no taller than 4 feet. In 1961, a couple in rural New Hampshire, Barney and Betty Hill, claimed aliens had abducted them. Alien abduction became a new fear for many, perhaps overly credulous Americans. Even the CIA secretly looked into it. Dr. H. Marshall Chadwell, CIA Chief of Scientific Intelligence, wrote in the 1950s, "Unexplained objects at great altitudes and traveling at high speeds in the vicinity of major U.S. defense installations are of such nature that they are not attributable to natural phenomenon or known types of aerial vehicles." Nonetheless, he also said, "A fair share of the U.S. population is mentally conditioned to the acceptance of the incredible." He warned that if the Soviets so chose, they could possibly spread misinformation about crazy phenomena, and a part of the U.S. population would buy into it. You might also say that it helped the CIA that people were focused on UFOs and not the shocking activities it was involved with. Such were the times. So when people began to read Sand's article on the Bermuda Triangle, an urban legend was born. People began to think our cosmic neighbors had possibly abducted those planes and ships. This was a good time to sell magazines and newspapers, so more people wrote about it. In 1962, a writer for the American Legion magazine, novelist Alan W. Eckert, didn't let the facts get in the way of a good tale when he said that one of the last communications from Flight 19 was, "We are entering white water. Nothing seems right. We don't know where we are. The water is green. No, white." Eckert's next comment would have had him flagged on Twitter, or X, in the present day, since he wrote that the Navy Board of Inquiry stated the planes actually flew off to Mars. Kirkus Reviews rightly later said that Mr. Eckert was fond of employing poetic license when it came to his versions of the facts. But that doesn't mean people didn't have the right to feel somewhat perplexed and excited about what was happening in this ocean stretch. Weird things had happened, or at least it seemed that way. No one disputes that many ships and planes have vanished in the area. The question is there anything paranormal going on? Before we answer that, let's hear a few more stories. In 1918, the USS Cyclops set off from Brazil, carrying 306 passengers and crew. She was to take a shipment of magnesium ore to Baltimore, Maryland, in the US, but somewhere along the way she vanished. It was a hell of a lot of ship to disappear. The vessel had a displacement of 19,360 long tons, or 19,670 tons when full. Its length measured 542 feet. That's a lot smaller than the ill-starred Titanic, which had a displacement of 52,310 tons, but it's still a huge hunk of steel to lose. It happens, of course, but what doesn't usually happen is a ship's sister ship goes down in the same area. In 1941, one of her sister ships, the USS Proteus, vanished with her 58 crew members somewhere in the Bermuda Triangle. This was the time of World War II, but it seems no German U-boats were deployed to the area. Like the Cyclops, the disappearance of the Proteus remains a mystery. The Cyclops had 3 sister ships in total, the Proteus being one, the Nereus being another. Life aboard the Nereus turned out to be not much fun either. She also disappeared in 1941. Since, like the Proteus, she was carrying cargo that would have gone to the war effort, some believe the Germans were responsible, but again, U-boats were not in the Bermuda Triangle. A naval history website jokingly wrote about this. Neither loss was the result of German submarines, so either the Bermuda Triangle aliens had it in for that class of ship, or there was something wrong with the design of the ship when carrying ore, which was denser than coal. We'll come back to this observation later. The only sister ship left was the USS Jupiter, AC-3, which was converted into the U.S. Navy's first aircraft carrier, USS Langley. On February 27, 1942, Japanese bombers hit her with 5 heavy bombs. 13 crew died in the initial attack. That ship was abandoned. Many survivors were transferred to the USS Pecos, which the Japanese also attacked. 400 men died, 319 of whom were from the Langley. Talk about an unlucky class of ships. We digress, back to the Bermuda Triangle. It's often said the loss of the USS Cyclops was the single largest loss of U.S. Navy lives on the high seas when not directly involved in combat. You can read that just about anywhere online, but some historians have pointed out that the USS Insurgent deserves that spot. It too was a Bermuda Triangle casualty. The Insurgent used to be L'Insurgent since it was French, but it was captured by the U.S. in the Quasi-War. The conflict started after Congress in 1793 suspended repayment of French loans after the U.S. borrowed to fight the British in the War of Independence. It's a bit more complicated than that, but we don't really have time to talk about U.S. military history in detail today. All you need to know is that the U.S. rumbled the French and expropriated this rather large frigate. On August 8, 1800, it sailed into the Bermuda Triangle on its way to the West Indies and was never seen again. All 340 crew vanished with the ship. The USS Pickering and her 105 crew also went down that August, also in the Bermuda Triangle. 2 ships, 2 disasters, similar area. Speculation said it must have been the same storm that hit both, but it was all speculation. So you can understand how the whole Bermuda Triangle thing got off the ground. Got off the ground is an unfortunate choice of words when we consider the planes that went down in this region. In the late 1940s, there was a spate of plane disappearances there. One was the loss of the BSAA Star Tiger, the passenger plane operated by British South American Airways, a commercial airline business run by the British and responsible for taking people to the Caribbean and South America. On January 30, 1948, it vanished. There was no distress call. The plane and its 31 passengers and crew were never seen again. The Brits launched an investigation into the tragedy, after which it was stated, in the complete absence of any reliable evidence as to either the nature or the cause of the accident of the Star Tiger, the court has not been able to do more than suggest possibilities, none of which reaches the level of even probability. What happened in this case will never be known, and the fate of the Star Tiger must remain an unsolved mystery. That would have been bad enough by itself. But then, later that year, the same thing happened to an American airliner, a Douglas DST, which was carrying 29 passengers and 3 crew members, including families who were returning to the U.S. after spending their Christmas vacation in Puerto Rico. 2 passengers were just babies. We know the passengers were in a good mood, a festive mood. Before the accident, the plane's captain, Robert Lindquist, was heard on the radio saying, "What do you know, we're all singing Christmas carols." As the passengers slept, the plane approached Miami. Lindquist told ground control, "We're approaching field, only 50 miles out to the south, all's well. We'll stand by for landing instructions." That was the last anyone heard from the cockpit. There was no SOS call. The U.S. Weather Bureau later said that the flying conditions were ideal that night. 48 Coast Guard, Air Force, and Navy ships scanned where the wreckage should have been, but nothing of the plane crew or their belongings was ever found. These were the days when flying was still novel for the public, a luxury that was nevertheless uncomfortable. As one history website writes, flying was loud, cold, and unsettling. Airliners were not pressurized, so they flew at low altitudes and were often bounced about by wind and weather. It was expensive, too, around $260 in the 1940s to go coast to coast in the U.S. That's close to $3,500 in today's money. Flying was way too expensive for most people until the late 50s. In the 40s, flying was a luxurious way to risk your life. That much was evident when, just after the American airliner vanished, another British South American Airways flight disappeared over the Bermuda Triangle, again making no distress call. All 7 crew and 13 passengers went down with the plane. Subsequent investigations led to the conclusion that this was yet another unsolved mystery. It wasn't until 1964 that the term Bermuda Triangle was used. As you'll remember, George Sand had talked about a watery triangle bounded by Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, but he hadn't expressly written about the Bermuda Triangle. That job fell to an American writer of everything paranormal, Vincent Gaddis. He penned the term in Argosy magazine, one of those adventure magazines that were very popular with the boys and the men back in those days. Adventure and detective mags were for those people like YouTube is for you these days. Although we hope that here at the Infographic Show we're not quite as unscientific as Mr. Gaddis was back in the 60s. Here's a snippet of text from Gaddis's now famous story. The mysterious menace that haunts the Atlantic off our southeastern coast had claimed 2 more victims. Before this article reaches print, it may strike again, swallowing a plane or a ship or leaving behind a derelict with no life aboard. Imagine reading that while your father is shouting at you to do your job and milk the cows. People loved a good mystery. Gaddis's story contained a lot of factual information about the mysterious vanishings of planes and ships. Still, at various points in the article, he suggests something unnatural was to blame for those many tragedies. After Gaddis ignited the storm of conspiracy theories, there have been all sorts of hypotheses, ranging from alien abductions to huge sea monsters dragging down the ships or snatching planes out of the sky. Others have said the Bermuda Triangle is some vortex into another dimension, possibly to the lost city of Atlantis. Then there are the alien theories. Others have been slightly more scientific by saying maybe the reason is the ocean farting and occasionally blasting out large amounts of methane gas. But some have talked about something much more prosaic, admittedly not anywhere near as exciting as the conspiracy theories. Maybe, these rationalists have said, a lot of the accidents were down to human error and/or vehicle malfunctions. Take for example Flight 19. We already know the compasses on Captain Tyler's plane were malfunctioning. He also had a hangover that day and wasn't wearing a watch, a much-needed instrument back then. Compasses and watches were how you navigated in those days. His men, who would have strictly followed his orders, might not have had the courage to tell him he was heading in the wrong direction. Maybe, and sorry to say this, his dear mum might have been wrong and the Navy was right. In fact, one of his trainees can be heard saying at one point, "Why don't we fly to the west?" Taylor wanted to go east, which was further into the ocean. Also, the planes they were flying, sometimes called Iron Birds, were like flying tanks. They were heavy, about 10,000 pounds each. When they went down fast and hard. And if they hit the water that day, it is likely they descended to the bottom of the ocean very quickly. As for the rescue planes, the PBM Mariner was known as the flying gas tank, since even a little spark could make one explode. No wonder the Navy stopped producing them in 1949. When the plane went missing on that fateful day, a nearby ship reported it had seen a giant fireball in the sky. A little later, when the ship was close to the location where the Mariner had seen this ball of fire, it sailed through an oil slick. That day, there were also squalls on the surface, and at 1,000 feet, wind speeds were around 40 miles per hour, with 75-mile-per-hour winds at 8,000 feet. This was recorded at 4 p.m. that day, not long before the accident. If a ship or a plane goes down in this area, there's every chance it could slip into one of the many trenches, some of the deepest on the planet. The seafloor of the Bermuda Triangle is about 19,000 feet down at one tip in the south and 27,500 feet down at the Puerto Rico tip. That's not much less than the lowest in the world, which is the Marianas Trench in the Pacific Ocean between Guam and the Philippines. It's 35,814 feet below sea level. While the hypothesis of methane erupting causing ships to struggle to stay afloat is possibly true, it's been proven such eruptions could mess up a ship's day. Bad weather is the most likely culprit for the accidents. Back before weather satellites became a thing in the 1960s, hurricanes would have hit without people knowing. Hence all the stories of distress signals not being issued. But the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, or NOAA, has another theory. That is, there is no such thing as a Bermuda Triangle phenomenon at all. It says there's merely a lot of traffic in the area, and if you look at the number of ships and planes going through it compared to the number of disappearances, it's not any worse than any other part of the world's oceans. Terrible tragedies have happened on the high seas all over the world. In terms of loss of life in the U.S. Navy, not directly related to combat, we tend not to hear too much about Typhoon Cobra, which in December of 1944, during the war, ripped through the United States Pacific Fleet in the Philippine Sea. It sank destroyers USS Hull, USS Spence, and USS Monaghan, and 28 other vessels were damaged. The wind blew at 160 miles per hour, and violent waves swept dozens of aircraft from the carriers. 790 men were killed and 80 more were injured. No one talks about a Philippines triangle after that, despite the tragedy being the worst thing of its kind in U.S. history, possibly all of naval history. Sure, the ships didn't just vanish, but that's because they weren't alone. One ship out there in that storm could certainly have disappeared without a trace. And do you remember the USS Cyclops and her two sister ships that sank? Well, it might not have been bad weather that sank the Cyclops. It's now thought that the manganese ore it was carrying, which is much denser than coal, had room to move around in the holds even when full. When it gets wet, it can get slurry, said one expert, and this could have caused the ship to list or tilt to the side. Its sister ships were carrying something similar, bauxite ore. Just perhaps these ships, all belonging to the same class, were flawed in the design and not capable of carrying this kind of cargo in bulk. Moving on. It's close to the equator, near a wealthy part of the world, America, therefore you have a lot of traffic, said a scientist for the NOAA when talking about the Bermuda Triangle. He cited studies undertaken by Lloyd's of London and the U.S. Coast Guard, stating that they came to the same conclusion he has, that the combined forces of nature and human fallibility outdo even the most incredulous science fiction. He did say the weather is bad there, yes, that's a factor. He even did some research on methane gas eruptions and found out that the gas could possibly rise into the air and cause a plane to blow up when the gas mixed with engine exhaust. A United States Geological Survey scientist confirmed this could happen, but that scientist said such a blowout hasn't been seen for 15,000 years. Granted, the story of the two missing boys is a strange one. It's now known that they had prepared for bad weather. The National Weather Service issued a special marine warning when they were out there, warning ships to be careful as heavy rains and winds faster than 40 miles per hour were on their way. When one of the boys wrote "We're effed," his friend said the accompanying video showed a storm on the horizon. What is still weird is why they turned the engine off and why the iPhone that was found was turned off. This all looked a bit iffy by anyone's standards, as did the fact that the boys' bodies weren't on the boat. People wondered, was this like one of those stories where young men see something they shouldn't see, such as someone trafficking huge amounts of illegal substances? It wouldn't be the first time that's happened. The iPhone could possibly hold the answers, but Apple couldn't get under the hood. One of the parents said to the media, "We're not giving up on the iPhone's potential for evidence until all viable efforts have been exhausted." Apple did try and do a recovery job, but had to take the thing apart and clean it, and that seems to have wiped all the logs. Was Apple in on it? Maybe the traffickers were working with the government and the government with Apple. Now we're joking here. We don't think that. But if you believe in the Bermuda Triangle, it wouldn't be a stretch to believe the other story. The boys are still missing. It's a very real tragedy for the parents, as it must have been for the families and the relatives of all the others who have died in the Bermuda Triangle. And we very much doubt that stories of sea monsters and vortexes to Atlantis help any of those people. The truth is out there, but it's usually not anywhere near as entertaining as the speculation. What goes up doesn't always come down. On a warm day in July, the third richest man in the world boarded his private plane in the UK to make a short trip to Belgium. 6 other people were on that plane, and yet this man somehow disappeared mid-flight. This is one of the most baffling mysteries in human history, about a man who was both loved and hated, a man whose great wealth generated acres of envy. He was tied to strange and questionable business deals, and he was about to work with one of the biggest names in organized crime to bring chaos and pain to Europe. What happened to Alfred Lowenstein is a question for the ages. The farther you go down the rabbit hole in the story, the more dirt you're exposed to. So prepare to get dirty. Long before Lowenstein became known as the man that went missing from the sky, he was making some serious money in Europe. In the 1920s, he was often cited as being the third richest person on Earth, with a wealth close to that of names such as John D. Rockefeller and Henry Ford. To give you an idea of his fortune, you need to hear this. When World War I started, Belgium was neutral. But as Germany needed to go through Belgium to get to France and complete its Schlieffen Plan, Belgium was invaded and occupied, and that's why Britain joined the war. This was a tough time for Belgium. It's also the time that Mr. Lowenstein told the Belgian government he'd give the country a $50 million interest-free loan to help stabilize its currency. But under one condition, he asked for the ability to print his own Belgian francs. The government didn't take him up on his offer. But what's important here is that $50 million back then is about $1.5 billion in today's money. This was a powerful man, and he was willing to make enemies to become even more powerful. His objective was to become the main player on the world stage of finance. He didn't mind flashing his cash, too, or being shrewd to the point of cruelty, which was another reason he didn't exactly make many friends. Lowenstein was greedy as they come, and if you look at the mafia connection in this story, you'll start to understand that he was prepared to make large parts of society suffer just to put more money in his already bulging bank account. Lowenstein was born on March 11, 1877, to a long line of wealthy Jewish-German bankers. He was destined to be rich, and he didn't waste much time getting there. He started making extreme amounts of money when he created the Société Internationale d'Énergie Hydroélectrique. With this company, he promised to deliver electricity to many underdeveloped nations in the world, and this is why he made a fortune at the start of the 20th century. Excuse the pun, but his electricity business made him one of the world's most powerful men. He was given the name the Flying Financier since he was very fond of his private planes, a big luxury back then. After the Belgian government snubbed his $50 million loan offer, Lowenstein moved to England and became Captain Lowenstein in the military, where he'd make a large chunk of money selling military supplies to the British Army. After the war, he stayed in England, and in 1926, he started his own investment firm. Various ventures made him tons of cash, and he was soon one of the biggest names in Europe. The Brits liked his wealth, and so bestowed on him the title of Companion of the Most Honorable Order of the Bath. You don't need to know what that means, except for it's kind of a title the Brits give to rich people. With his firm, International Holdings and Investments Limited, Lowenstein told other rich folks that if they invested their money with him through building infrastructure around the world, he'd make them incredibly rich too. They invested, and they did so big time. This firm, combined with Lowenstein's involvement in the silk trade, is what made him his millions. You also need to know something about his personality. As we said, he wasn't one to hold back when it came to spending. How he spent the cash, though, is not always clear, and that's why he was sometimes called the mystery man of Europe. His big spending sprees also got him the moniker the Belgian Santa Claus. When he wasn't watching his finances grow, he was at the races watching one of his thoroughbreds compete. His horses actually won the 1926 and 1928 runnings of the Grand Steeplechase de Paris. This is a man that had his fingers in as many pies as all of the bakers in Belgium. If he should somehow die, there'd be a lot of money left behind. There'd be a lot of upset investors, too. And while for the most part he'd made money in Europe, people knew that he was about to come to America, but with another goal in mind. He didn't just want to be wealthier, he wanted to stand on top of the world. Speaking about the US and his plans for the country, he once said, "I've always made use of what are called American methods. I like American energy and American efficiency. In many ways, my point of view is similar to that of the American businessman." Even though his business in America wasn't purely about money, he made some strange acquaintances such as Arnold Rothstein, a person many historians call the world's first ever drug trafficker. Rothstein, a Jewish American, was the architect of numerous ways to make money through crime and was sometimes called the Brain. He was an exceptional businessman and a gambler and even fixed huge sporting events such as the 1919 World Series. Rothstein was smart, and while he wasn't often violent himself, the word on the street was that if you did cross him, you will end up dead. He feared no one, not even the most brutal mafia bosses such as Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. Rather, they were probably scared of him. For Rothstein, crime was just another business in the game of capitalism, and if you wanted to run a crime empire, you should do it as you would a legal one. So when he first understood the addictive qualities of heroin, he knew he had to bring that stuff to the US. Heroin had been legal and controlled at the time, and there weren't many addicts, but that was changing. He'd seen how much cash prohibition generated, and he knew that drugs were the next big thing. Rothstein once had a meeting about his new drug business and told the other criminals in attendance prohibition is going to last a long time and then one day it'll be abandoned. But it's going to be with us for quite a while, that's for sure. We can make a fortune. But how does Lowenstein, a wealthy financier, come into this? Well, like we told you that he liked to have his fingers in many pies, and even though he may not have been a gangster, he knew that a highly addictive drug being used all over Europe and the rest of the world had the potential to make him millions. Rothstein might not have been as rich as him, but he wasn't far off, so he respected Rothstein. The connection between these two men was talked about briefly in the anti-drug war book, Chasing the Scream. It was written by the journalist Johan Hari, whose research shows that when the war on drugs kicked off, some cops were in cahoots with the mafia to ensure more drugs got into the country. So as the new drug acts were written up, Mr. Rothstein was rubbing his hands together so much they almost caught on fire. Then the US, through Anslinger, told other countries that they should also start their own war on drugs. Many said it wouldn't really work, and anyway, they had a matter of drugs under control. They didn't. The US then warned them that if they didn't start to actively fight against drug use, they'd institute sanctions. So one by one, most of the world jumped on the war on drugs train. Now Europe was a marketplace for illegal drugs, including the UK, where Lowenstein was based. We should also say that heroin was being legally produced in factories across Europe. This is where Rothstein sourced his heroin. He wanted to start a massive industrial drug manufacturing and smuggling business, but he needed help. We'll now give the floor to Hari, who wrote in his book, "One day, Arnold met in a hotel on East 42nd Street with Captain Alfred Lowenstein. With Rothstein, the captain signed the biggest drug deal in history up to that point, a plan to mass market a range of opiates to a growing new market. At this point, we should also remember that Lowenstein was involved in government dealings in Europe. He was one of the richest people in the world and pretty much helped develop part of the poorer world, leading him to a lot of political influence. He also had a lot of powerful and rich investors backing him, and some of them stood to make huge amounts of money off his new scheme. One of the many reasons for being this greedy? Maintaining his extravagant lifestyle. Staying with that Times article, the journalist said Lowenstein's spending habits were out of this world, with his weekly budget for all his requirements at his many mansions being $100,000, or $1.5 million in today's money. He was once having a dinner party at his luxury house in Biarritz, France, and he flew a private plane to Moscow just to pick up some caviar. The article also suggests his ridiculous spending had led to secret financial problems. His dealings with Rothstein escalated during a meeting in New York, where they discussed the finer details of their operation to fill the streets of Europe with now illegal heroin. Pietrusa's research shows that Lowenstein went to New York with 20 people in tow, including his 4 secretaries, 2 typists, his masseur, chauffeur, and of course his pilot. They met on East 42nd Street. Rothstein had about as many people around him as Lowenstein did. The Irish gangster and close associate bodyguard of Rothstein, a man nicknamed Legs Diamond, was also in attendance at the meeting. It was Diamond that later said that this historic meeting was probably the biggest drug transaction in the country at the time. Negotiations took hours, with Lowenstein as usual being very shrewd. At one point, Diamond said he stormed out in a huff, only for Rothstein to calm things down. Nat Ferber, a New York American reporter, knew about the meeting and questioned Rothstein about it. He asked Rothstein, "What are you and that Bert Lowenstein up to? I saw you at Grand Central." This apparently put the usually calm and collected Rothstein on edge. He didn't answer the question, and the conversation ended with Rothstein telling Ferber, "You'll get yours," meaning his comeuppance. We also know that Lowenstein flew to Montreal right after the meeting, and Rothstein followed him there by train. They talked again, and then Lowenstein sailed to France on the ship the Ile-de-France. It was springtime, and Lowenstein told Rothstein he'd be back to meet him in America in November, and that meeting did not take place. That's because on July 4th, not long after he returned to Europe, he would go on his final plane ride. Now, you all know the most important details about his life. It's time to tell you the strange tale of that plane journey. It was 6 p.m. when he boarded the plane at Croydon Airport in the south of England. The weather was mild and he was in a cheerful mood. He could sometimes have quite the temper, but on this day, according to later testimonies, he was laughing and joking. He was focused on business, but he was in good mood at the airport. The plane taking Lowenstein was a Fokker F-7, an aircraft he was well acquainted with. The pilot, Donald Drew, told him it would be a very smooth flight. It was a very smooth flight, just not a smooth landing, for Lowenstein anyway. The others on the flight were Fred Baxter, his valet, Arthur Hodgson, his secretary, and 2 stenographers, Eileen Clark and Paula Biadlin. There was also the pilot and a mechanic named Robert Little. They took off and were soon 4,000 feet in the air, peering down at the Kent coastline, and a few minutes later they were flying over the English Channel. An important detail about the plane layout is that there are 2 doors in a separate part of the plane at the rear of the cabin. One of them led to a bathroom, opposite was the door marked Exit. Unlike many planes, if you went to the bathroom, you had to leave the cabin. Lowenstein had designed the plane himself to make the cabin quiet so he could hold business meetings in the air. We should also say, no one in their right mind could mistake the bathroom for the exit. Anyway, as you'll see, to open it in midair would be really hard. You need a couple of bodybuilders even to shift the door, and Lowenstein was no bodybuilder. At one point, he stopped reading, stood up, and headed to the toilet. He walked through the door, and that was it. He was never seen again. It was his valet who first became suspicious, saying he went to check on Lowenstein after he'd been gone for about 10 minutes. The valet thought Lowenstein must have been in the toilet, but as he didn't answer the valet's calls, the door was pushed open. The toilet was empty. Just a few minutes ago, Lowenstein had been laughing and joking, and now he was gone. Nothing made sense. Where did Lowenstein go? He obviously wasn't in the cockpit. When the captain was told about what had happened, he landed the plane on a beach close to where an army company was stationed. This wasn't too far from Dunkirk. Soldiers saw the plane land and started running toward it. By the time they got there, all 6 passengers and crew were out on the beach. Lieutenant Marcaille was told about what had happened and why they had to perform an emergency landing. Marcaille later said he couldn't make sense of the situation, but remarked that the pilot was acting strange and not answering all of his questions. The plane was soon in the hands of the British Air Ministry. After a few tests, they announced that it would have been impossible to open that rear door during flight. And at the time, an aviation expert told The Times, when a plane is flying, it takes more than an ordinary push to open the door. Moreover, Captain Lowenstein was more than familiar with the plane. Also, even if he had been able to perform the impossible, the plane would have experienced turbulence from the change in the cross-section. How come everyone said they felt nothing? It was believed by some that if Lowenstein had gone out the door, then he would have had been pushed by someone. Remember, his vast wealth was now up for grabs. His many properties were also up for grabs, as were many of his businesses, so there were many reasons to assassinate the business magnate. This is why the people on the plane were interrogated numerous times. One of the detectives was Inspector Bonnet, who later concluded, "A most unusual and mysterious case. We have not yet made up our minds to define any theory, but anything is possible. He could hardly keep those people in custody because he really didn't have anything to go on in terms of evidence." Journalist Nat Ferber soon heard about the death. Then in November, he was told Arnold Rothstein was murdered. For Ferber, the fact that 2 men who were doing business together had just been killed rang some alarm bells. This is one theory on what could have happened. Rothstein needed to raise some money to create a drug empire like the world had never seen. Lowenstein, who had plenty of money, was willing to invest, but now Lowenstein was dead. Rothstein didn't have enough money to start the business to a scale that satisfied the expectations from other, more dangerous investors, so he was killed. He was shot at a business meeting in New York and was sent to the hospital. Cops turned up and asked him who did it, to which he replied, "You stick to your trade, I'll stick to mine." People also started talking about other reasons, such as Lowenstein's business worries, his extravagant spending, or him possibly letting down his investors. But when the New York Times investigated this, they found that his shares in one company alone were worth $25 million. As you now know, that's hundreds of millions in today's money. Lowenstein said the Times did not have money problems, although he certainly had some of his investors worried. The Times wrote, "So wide were his interests involving many billions that it was impossible to estimate the effect of his death. His death led to a significant downturn of the world's economy. Was all of this part of a larger conspiracy? People were asking this when his body was found. At least, a body the cops claim was him. It was found floating in the sea near Bologna on July 19th, just over 2 weeks after he went missing. The corpse was taken to Calais on a fishing boat, where police confirmed it was Lowenstein due to the wristwatch on the man's arm. Notably, forensic scientists said that Lowenstein had been alive when he hit the water. This wasn't a murder in the air, but that didn't mean he hadn't been thrown out of the plane. You can only imagine what would happen if, say, Bill Gates mysteriously fell out of an aircraft and died. So back then, this was a huge story. Some people then started saying his wife Madeleine had told his male secretary and perhaps another man to throw him out. In fact, they said that everyone on the plane was in on it. They all stood to get very rich if they kept their mouths shut. One investigator came to this conclusion. One thing is clear, all 6 people on board were almost certainly privy to the murder. Indeed, they had probably planned it carefully in advance. What's more, Madeleine didn't even go to his funeral. She was, after all, very busy playing with her new fortune. She also didn't seem to be too concerned that his name wasn't etched into his headstone, as he was effectively buried in an unmarked grave. As people enjoyed their windfall, he was resting for eternity in complete anonymity. It's also worth noting that 2 of his business partners, Albert Pam and Frederick Servasi, got very rich after his death, adding another 2 suspects to the conspiracy. In a book about Lowenstein called The Man Who Fell from the Sky, the author, William Norris, investigated the death, and he too said Madeleine had paid people on that plane to throw her husband out. He said the entire door was thrown out with the body. The reason the plane landed on the beach and not on a nearby airstrip was because the door needed to be secretly replaced. Many people stuck with the story of it being an accidental death, which to us sounds implausible. How could a man have pulled open a door that was pretty much impossible to open by accident? It's just not possible. The vast majority of people said it must have been a murder, and many people still think that now. But was Madeleine behind it, or was it someone else? Could something have gone wrong with the deal between Rothstein and Lowenstein? Had Rothstein somehow engineered the murder? Let's remind you again that Rothstein often broke bread with US politicians and some of the most powerful people in finance, people who may have profited from the death of a man who was planning to take over the world. Rothstein could have been involved with the murder, and once it was done, some people in high places could have had Rothstein killed to ensure nothing about this involvement with the Lowenstein murder ever came out. Rothstein's death remains a mystery today. One thing William Norris also discovered during his investigations in the 1990s is that after Lowenstein died, the stock for his international holdings company mysteriously went through the roof. $13 million, over $200 million today, seemed to just appear out of nowhere. So yes, there were a million reasons why someone might have wanted him dead, from business partners to his wife to his investors to America's richest organized criminal and perhaps even the US government. Still, the story the public heard in most newspapers was the implausible theory that Lowenstein had somehow accidentally walked through the wrong door mid-flight, a door with a large exit sign above it, a door that was virtually impossible to open on a plane Lowenstein was very familiar with. There is another theory that might make more sense to you. Imagine if Lowenstein wanted to go missing. Imagine if he had paid the people on the plane to help him go missing. He had so much money he could have lived the rest of his life in secret luxury. This is a scenario some crime writers have put forward over the years. With those insurance policies and his now rich wife, perhaps together they lived this secret life far from prying eyes. Is this why she didn't bother turning up to his funeral? Is this why he was buried in an unmarked grave? Was anyone even in the grave? Most people familiar with the case say there is no way he just accidentally stepped out of that plane. But what do you think? You're out shopping with your 5-year-old brother. It's been a long day and he's getting antsy. Thankfully, he's distracted with a little ball you got him from the vending machine. He's happily bouncing away, so you turn to the clothing rack and look at some shirts. You find one in the right size and turn around to take him to the cash register to pay, but he's not there. You only turned your back for a second, but he's disappeared without a trace. Seconds feel like hours as you frantically scan the area. Worst-case scenarios run through your mind. Then, you see a little ball roll out from under a nearby clothes rack, followed by a little hand reaching for it. He was hiding, and all's right with the world, save the scalding he's about to get. It only takes seconds for someone to disappear, and most of the time there's a simple explanation. That didn't happen for the people in this video. Some of them were young and anonymous, but others were old and had powerful enemies. One even disappeared twice, but they all have one thing in common. They vanished and were never seen again. Number 8. Owen Parfitt. Owen Parfitt was a man who had lived an interesting life, or at least he believed that, and he'd be the first to tell you. He claimed to be a pirate, a ladies' man, and an adventurer, but in the 1760s he was an old man who could barely walk and lived with his sister in Shepton Mallet. This sleepy town in southwest England was the last place you'd expect a mystery to be found, but mystery found Owen Parfitt one stormy day. Owen liked to spend his evenings sitting outside, but needed the help of his sister and neighbor to go get into his old chair on the front porch. After securing him in his chair for the evening, his sister went inside. The only people around were some farm workers down the road. As the sky darkened, Owen's sister came outside to bring him in away from the lightning, but Owen wasn't in his chair. There'd been no sign of a struggle outside and Owen hadn't made any noise. But there was no sign, and a disabled man certainly couldn't disappear on his own. Owen's sister approached the farm workers and neighbors to search the neighborhood, but no trace of him was ever found. Many rumors circulated around Shepton Mallet about where the old man had gone. Some say that he was taken by the devil to fulfill an old debt. Others said some old pirate enemies had kidnapped him in revenge. In 1813, a skeleton was found nearby, making many people sure the mystery would be solved. But medical experts identified it as a woman's skeleton, and Owen Parfitt's last adventure remains unsolved to this day. Number 7. Barbara Newhall Follett. One of the most famous people to ever disappear without a trace, Barbara Newhall Follett became a household name when most of us were still in middle school. The author of the novel The House Without Windows, she burst onto the literary scene only at 12 years old. A homeschooled and reclusive young woman, she had a troubled home life and felt that she'd already reached her life's peak by her teens. When the Great Depression hit, she was forced to move to New York and work as a secretary. There, she met Nickerson Rogers and was married by 18 years old. Their marriage soon hit rocky waters, and she believed her husband was cheating on her. They fought, and on December 7, 1939, she stormed out of their apartment with only $30 on her. Rogers assumed she'd be home shortly and waited for her, but he would be waiting a very long time. It was 2 weeks later when he finally reported Follett's disappearance to the police, and 4 months before a missing persons notice was issued. Because the bulletin used her married name, Follett's disappearance didn't attract much attention. Follett was never found, but her mother Helen never stopped searching. As the years went on, she became more suspicious of Rogers and accused him of being involved in her daughter's disappearance. Although she demanded the police investigate Rogers, no evidence of foul play was ever found. Barbara Follett's disappearance remains unsolved, and the girl who was thrust onto the national stage early had managed to disappear into thin air. Number 6. Keith Reinhard. Keith Reinhard was a sports reporter who was tired of the daily grind. He had dreams of opening up an antique shop and decided to move to the quiet town of Silver Plume, Colorado in 1988. His old friend Ted Parker lived there, and he was looking forward to the proximity to another man who loved the outdoors. But tragedy and mystery would follow Reinhard and Parker as they settled into their new life. Reinhard opened up his antique shop and hoped his wife would join him soon, but he soon learned that his building had a dark secret. The previous owner, Tom Young, had vanished a year earlier, with his body found 10 months later along with his dogs, both shot to death. One day, not long after the gruesome discovery, Keith decided he would climb to the top of nearby Pendleton Mountain, the site of the bodies. He visited Ted, who assumed his friend would back out when he saw how hard the climb was, but Keith Reinhard made his way up to the mountain regardless and never came down. Those who saw him before he set out said he carried no supplies. Helicopters searched the mountain for signs of him for days, but no sign of Keith Reinhard was ever found. A search of his business found that he'd been collecting news reports of Tom Young's disappearance and had been writing morbid poetry. Some locals suspect it was a suicide. Others say he planned his disappearance to escape debts and a failing business. Others say that whoever killed Tom Young had claimed another victim. But Keith Reinhard has never been found, dead or alive. Number 5. Ray Gricar. Working in law enforcement will earn you powerful enemies, and one Pennsylvania district attorney might have found out that the wrong way. Ray Gricar was a veteran lawman, serving as Center County District Attorney for 20 years. He was ready to retire in 2005, planning to step down after the end of his term, but he never got to serve out that last term, and instead became the subject of one of the most mysterious disappearances of the 21st century. On April 15, 2005, Gricar called his girlfriend Patty Fornicola to let her know he was coming home only minutes away, but he never returned home, and soon she called the police. Even though he was only missing for hours, he was a prominent citizen, and the police sprung into action. The next morning, they found a disturbing sight in a local parking lot, his red Mini Cooper, with no sign of Ray Gricar. There were no signs of foul play, but if Gricar had left on his own, he made sure he couldn't be found. His cell phone was still in the car, but his computer, keys, and wallet had been taken. There was no sign of foul play, and many suspected suicide. Gricar's older brother Roy had committed suicide in 1996, and the car was found in a similar position to Roy's on that fateful day. His laptop was found at the bottom of the Susquehanna River months later, missing its hard drive. A damaged hard drive was found months later, but it was badly damaged and not giving up its secret. Gricar's daughter petitioned the court to declare him dead 6 years later, and his fate remains unsolved. A man resembling him was arrested in Utah, but was eventually proven to not be Gricar. Wherever Ray Gricar went, he took his secrets with him. Number 4. The mystery of the Bennington Triangle. Rural southwestern Vermont is one of the sleepiest locations in the U.S., but in the 1940s it became a place of terror. The Bennington Triangle is an area of small towns surrounding Glastonbury Mountain, now a popular hiking area. It was 1945 when the disappearances started, with 74-year-old Middle Rivers. A local hunter, he was with a group of 4 on the mountain when he got separated from the group. Locals combed the area, but all they ever found was one of his rifle shells. Rivers knew the area well and was an experienced survivalist, but he was never seen again. He was followed just over a year later by college student Paula Jean Weldon, a sophomore at nearby Bennington College. She went for a hike on the nearby trail seen by many locals. An old couple hiking reported seeing her on the trail ahead of them, but when they reached her location, she had vanished without a trace. The FBI got involved in the case and a reward was offered, but much like Rivers, she vanished into thin air. It was 3 years later when the mystery of the Bennington Triangle struck again. Elderly veteran James Tedford was riding a bus back to his home at the Bennington Soldiers' Home and was seen on the bus at the last stop before Bennington. Somewhere between there and home, he vanished. His luggage was still on the rack, his bus timetable still on the seat, but James Tedford had inexplicably vanished. He was followed by 8-year-old Paul Jeffson, who disappeared from his mother's truck while she got out to feed the pigs. She was gone for an hour, and when she returned, Paul was gone. No evidence of him was ever found. 53-year-old Frida Langer was the last to disappear only a month after Paul, having disappeared after returning to her campsite for a change of clothes. Her body was eventually found almost a year later after an exhaustive search, the only victim to be found, but no cause of death could ever be determined. The Bennington Triangle had claimed its last victim, but its mysteries were never solved. Number 3. Joseph Force Crater. A powerful judge facing a career-ending scandal may have been an enemy he couldn't outrun, or found an unconventional way out of his troubles. Joseph Force Crater was already a household name in New York before his disappearance in 1930, having risen to the rank of state Supreme Court Justice. But he had a history of corruption, including a mysterious withdrawal that many suspect was a payoff to the Tammany Hall political machine. He used his position as a bankruptcy receiver to get a huge profit, leading many to accuse him of money laundering. Was this what led to his disappearance? Crater and his wife Sheila were vacationing in Maine when he received a mysterious call that led him to drive back into the city in a hurry. He promised his wife that he would return by her birthday, but his behavior in New York aroused suspicion. He combed his courthouse files, he carried locked briefcases out of his office, and he had his file clerk cash 2 massive checks, almost $80,000 in today's money. Crater had dinner with friends that night and planned to see a Broadway show, but afterwards accounts differ. Some of his friends say he left in a taxi, others say he walked down the street, but no one thought anything of it until he didn't return to Maine. His wife frantically called his friends but got no answer. The police weren't notified until almost a month after he disappeared, and the disappearance of Judge Crater became national news. The police interrogated many women in Atlantic City who Crater had been involved with, but none knew where he had gone. An investigation was inconclusive to declare Crater alive or dead. Did an old enemy take revenge on Crater for his corruption, or did he escape and take on a new identity? A possible break in the case came 85 years later when a recently deceased woman left notes claiming that Crater had been killed by a corrupt NYPD officer on the orders of Murder Inc. She gave directions to where he was buried in Coney Island, but no remains were found. Number 2. Tara Calico. The disappearance of Tara Calico is one of the most haunting unexplained disappearances. Not because of what we don't know, but because of what we do. Only 19 years old, Calico was fond of riding her bicycle along New Mexico State Road 47. She often rode with her mother, Patty, but Patty stopped riding because she thought a driver was stalking them. Patty warned Tara to be careful, but Tara wasn't worried. On Tuesday, September 20th, 1988, Tara didn't return from her ride. Patty went out searching for her and contacted the police. They found pieces of her Sony Walkman, and witnesses said they saw her on her bike ride, closely followed by an unknown driver in a pickup truck. A chilling break in the case came almost a year later, on June 15, 1989. Across the country, in Port St. Joe, Florida, a photograph was found in the parking lot of a convenience store. It showed a young woman bound and gagged in the trunk of a car next to a young boy. The woman who found the photo of the two kidnapping victims said she saw a windowless van driven by a man with a mustache. Police were unable to chase the van down. Patty identified the woman in the picture as Tara based on a scar on her leg, and the boy was initially identified as the missing Michael Henley. But the New Mexico boy's body was found a year later near where he disappeared, having died from exposure after getting lost. The boy in the picture has never been identified, and Tara Calico was never seen again. Number 1. Solomon Northup. One of the most famous missing person stories in history, Solomon Northup's tale became a best-selling memoir and an Oscar-winning biopic. But what happened to him after remains a mystery. Northup was a free-born black man living in New York in the early 1800s, but the southern states didn't care about that. When Northup, a traveling musician, went to Washington, D.C. to perform in 1841, he was drugged and kidnapped. He was sent to New Orleans, where he was sold as a slave. For 12 years, he was sent from one owner to another and treated brutally, until he met a Canadian worker who heard his story and got him legal help in New York. Upon his return to New York in 1853, he published his memoir, 12 Years a Slave. But the years of hard labor and beatings had taken their toll on Northup, and he was reported to be a drunken and depressed man. Although he found a second career as a speaker on the brutality of slavery, he often faced violent crowds opposed to his message. By 1858, he had disappeared off the map, and not even his wife or children knew where he was. Many speculated he'd been killed by his enemies who wanted to silence him, or had been kidnapped again and sold into slavery despite being an older man who would be of little use on a farm. A more optimistic rumor is that he couldn't stand doing nothing while others were in slavery and he left to join the Underground Railroad. Or maybe while drinking to escape his horrible memories, he simply met his end by falling into a nearby lake. Solomon Northup's words impacted the world long after he was gone, but the man disappeared without a trace. If you had picked up a copy of the New York Times on November 22, 1963, you would have seen the historic headline, "Kennedy is killed by sniper as he rides in car in Dallas." The article explains that the 46-year-old President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, died from an injury to the brain. If you look at the timeline of events that day, you'll find he made his last public speech at 9:25 a.m. He grabbed some breakfast after that. Then at 11:20 a.m. he boarded Air Force One and headed to Dallas. Somewhat sadly ironic, he landed at a place called Love Field where he was greeted by admiring fans. Surrounded by bodyguards, JFK smiles and shakes hands with people waiting behind the fences. In approximately 45 minutes, his life will be over. This event in some ways changed the course of U.S. history. As most of you know, a man called Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for the murder. 3 minutes after the assassination, he left the Texas School Book Depository building. Around 30 minutes after the president was shot, doctors at Parkland Hospital announced that indeed, the beloved president to many was no more. At 1:22 p.m., police found a rifle hidden in the building where Oswald exited earlier. He was arrested soon after, but by that time, he'd already shot and killed a police officer on the street. He'd hidden in a movie theater after that, but was picked up by cops for the police officer slaying. Some hours later, he was charged with killing the president. Oswald himself wouldn't live much longer, being shot and killed by a nightclub owner called Jack Ruby in the basement of the Dallas Police Headquarters 2 days later. This is the bare-bones account of what happened that day and soon after, and we're not going to attempt to investigate what might have happened. Something called the Warren Commission concluded that Oswald acted alone and fired 3 shots. The FBI and Secret Service agreed. Nonetheless, many Americans didn't agree and still don't. There are numerous theories as to what happened that day, where the bullets came from, who did the firing, and who, if anyone, sanctioned the hit. This isn't a show about the multiple theories, but a show about a missing body part, namely the president's brain. If you look at the death certificate, you can find that JFK died from a shot to the skull, but he was also shot in the back. Part of the report written by JFK's personal physician reads that what happened was a shattering in type causing a fragmentation of the skull and evulsion of 3 particles of the skull at a time of the impact, with resulting maceration of the right hemisphere of the brain. In the crudest terms, he literally had part of his head blown off. You can see a diagram drawn by the House Committee of what damage the bullet to the head did, and after seeing that, you will surely agree that it would have taken a miracle to survive such an injury. That said, even though the impact was devastating, his brain didn't just explode. The skull was indeed fragmented, but it remained held by flaps of skin. This isn't a story about pieces of tissue or bone going missing in the street that day, or on the way to the hospital. What we're saying is that President Kennedy's brain is literally missing, the full item. What we want to know is, where is it? You see, JFK's brain was removed during the autopsy and stored in the National Archives. 3 years after that autopsy, it was gone. The president's brain had mysteriously sprouted some legs and taken off. That or someone had taken it. The fact that this brain had disappeared, of course, has sparked numerous conspiracy theories. Word on Conspiracy Street is that someone had sequestered the dead man's thinking organ because, had they not, it would have been revealed that he was not shot in the back of the head, but actually in the front, which would have somewhat challenged the Oswald did it alone theory. By the way, it's not a conspiracy theory that the brain vanished. It is absolutely true. If you were around in 1978, you might have seen a paper written by the Congressional House Select Committee on Assassinations, and in it, you'd have read that JFK's brain was officially missing. Okay, so what really happened? It's the million-dollar question. Some doctors at the hospital who were around for the autopsy would testify that they witnessed First Lady Jackie Kennedy holding the brain at one point, but not taking off with it. Others would say the organ was put inside a stainless steel box and then handed to the Secret Service. It was supposedly stored at the White House, and then JFK's brother, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, ordered that it be held in the National Archives. Is that true? Well, in 2016, the National Archives, under the Freedom of Information Act, released 3,063 documents that had been fully withheld since the assassination. The problem is, none of those files tells us where the brain is, and some sources tell us that the National Archives inventory didn't have JFK's brain on it. Anyway, if it was there, it's not there now, that's for sure. How an assassinated president's brain can just go missing seems totally absurd, especially when it's a piece of a puzzle that has conjured up so many conspiracy theories. Let's face it, the fact it's missing is enough to pique the interest of the least skeptical person. You don't have to believe the moon is made of cheese or that a spherical Earth is a joke to be very curious about where the brain went and why it vanished into thin air. There is a theory, though, that the missing organ may have been down to the brother. There was a book published in 2014 called End of Days: The Assassination of John F. Kennedy, and the author James Swanson said the brain might have been removed by Robert Kennedy, perhaps to conceal evidence of the true extent of President Kennedy's illness, or perhaps to conceal evidence of the number of medications that President Kennedy was taking. He said it could have been a face-saving operation by the sibling to protect his brother's name. It wouldn't be the first time a brain of a famous person went missing. Albert Einstein, one of the biggest brainiacs ever to walk the earth, had his organ taken by the pathologist who performed the autopsy, even though the family didn't know about it. He kept it for years, but now it's partly at the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. Body parts of other geniuses and renowned people have gone missing in time and turned up again, such as Mozart's skull, Galileo's fingers, while the writer and revolutionary Thomas Paine was exhumed in the USA and then taken back to his native England, only to go missing. Still, this seems more like ancient history, and the JFK assassination is still busy toying with conspiracy theorists' mind. In an interview with the Boston Magazine in 2013, that author we just mentioned, James Swanson, said he had meticulously researched the JFK assassination. He said there is no doubt whatsoever that President Kennedy was buried without his brain. The government records and reports prove that it's so. He added that he hates to say it, but it's just totally bizarre. The reason he doesn't like saying it is because there are so many myths and conspiracy theories about the assassination already. But the missing brain is real, make no mistake about it. He said documents show that it was at the National Archives, but it wasn't alone. His exact words were that it was placed with dozens of medical glass slides from the autopsy, tissue samples, blood samples, and bone fragments. Then it was discovered on all days of Halloween on 1966 that not only the brain but the entire locker and autopsy materials had vanished, and those materials have never been seen since. As you know, he thinks the brother took it, and he certainly doesn't think it was taken because there was evidence pointing toward Oswald not doing the killing. He thinks what happened is the official version of events. In his words, this is why Robert Kennedy took the brain, to preserve his brother's legacy and image and legend. John F. Kennedy was very sick through much of his life. He was in great pain. He was taking multiple medications. That was never known to the American people. Still, a cleanup operation by the brother to ensure the American people's bubble didn't get burst regarding their legendary leader might be a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people. Do you have a theory? We're sorry we couldn't give you answers because this is still an enduring bona fide mystery. Tell us where you think the brain is in the comments. Also, be sure to watch our other video, the JFK assassination. What really happened? Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.